Hey guys, tonight we slip into a moon-cold Paleolithic night and hold a torch to the tallest stories humans ever told. You crouch at the mouth of a limestone cave, breath-turning silver, while the wall shivers with ochre herds and outstretched hands. Quick reality check: if a real 12-foot human ducked in here, you probably won't survive this handshake. So let's keep our giants in the safe museum of imagination for now. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Tell me your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing the map of night unfold. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You lift the torch a warm circle, breathing on stone, and aim your question with care. What exactly counts as a giant? Definitions are your night vision goggles. For this trip, a prehistoric giant is human, or human-like, not a dinosaur in sandals, and so large that ordinary body plans start to wobble. Put numbers to it every day. Tall begins near 2.0 meters. Very tall lives above about 2.2. And giant, for our purposes, means approaching or exceeding 2.4 meters in healthy adulthood without modern medicine. Above that, physics starts clearing its throat. You're not banning wonder, only giving it a ruler. You lay out rules simple enough to remember when your toes go numb. Rule 1: bones beat anecdotes. Stories travel. Femora stay put and arrive with lengths, diameters, and the company they kept in the dirt, artifacts. Rule 2: context rules all. A long bone found in a field is romantic. The same bone in a well-dated layer is evidence. Rule 3: math isn't here to kill the vibe, it's here so ankles don't. The square cube law says that as bodies scale up, weight rises faster than strength, so bones must get proportionally thicker, hearts must push blood farther uphill, and cooling becomes a full-time job. Joke 1: square cube law doesn't have a gym membership, but it still benches your dreams. For calibration, you tuck a modern yardstick into your pocket. The tallest reliably measured person on record, Robert Wadlow, reached 8'11" 2.72 pounds in the 1930s because of pituitary hyperplasia. He walked with leg braces. His life doesn't debunk giants. It maps the edge of what human biology tolerates. So when you hear of healthy spear-throwing tribes of 9 to 10 footers in deep time, you don't roll your eyes, you reach for tape measures, excavations, and peer review. Light joke: no, you can't carbon date a screenshot. Your light roams the wall and finds hand stencils, some child small, some surprisingly long. Handprints aren't tape measures. If you want height, you go to long bones, femur, and tibia, and you use established formulas that translate bone length into stature. And you watch for the classic mistake: mixing bones from different individuals or species. Field joke: if the giant has a cow's pelvis and a human shin, you've built a minotaur by accident. You pan from people to the neighbors who shared their world. The late Pleistocene is crowded with genuine giants, mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses, cave bears, whose tracks and bones thread through human camps. A solid fact to anchor you after about 50,000 years ago. Anatomically modern humans share parts of Eurasia with Neanderthals, who on average are shorter and stockier than you, with barrel chests and powerful limbs adaptations that conserve heat. Height alone isn't prowess. Build, diet, and climate tell a fuller story. Zoom the lens with a quick height tour. Upper Paleolithic Homo sapiens, males in Europe, often cluster around roughly 5'6", 5'10", about 168 to 178 centimeter, with regional wiggle, depending on diet and disease. Neanderthals average a little shorter, but broader, trading centimeters for sturdiness. With farming stature often dips, then rebounds where nutrition improves. Historians still argue whether that rebound reflects genetics, nutrition, or both. The point for you tonight is simple. ordinary human height has a wide, healthy range long before modern medicine. But the fossil and skeletal record does not show stable populations of giants towering over everyone else. Now, a quirky tidbit because old dirt has a sense of humor. In Mediterranean lands, people sometimes unearthed elephant or mastodon skulls. The big central nasal cavity where the trunk anchored looks like a single huge eye socket. One skull, one sailor with a good imagination, and hello Cyclops. Elsewhere, medieval churches displayed giant bones that later proved to be whale ribs or mammoth femora. Without zoology, a rib the size of a roof beam makes a persuasive sermon illustration. With zoology, it becomes a teaching prop. Still, you treat myths with respect. They aren't newspapers. They're memory theaters. Giants can stand in for mountains, storms, invading armies, or the swaggering neighbor clan up the valley. Historians still argue whether giant tales preserve blurry folk memories of megafauna or momentary encounters with unusually tall individuals, or whether they're purely symbolic moral lessons stretched to dramatic scale. Your job isn't to punish poetry. It's to ask gently what each story was doing for the people who told it, and then to see if the ground agrees. So you sketch your field kit in your mind. If someone waves a giant at you, you ask, where were the bones found? Was the excavation controlled? Are the bones demonstrably human and from the same individual? Do associated artifacts place them in a known culture? Can we radiocarbon date collagen? Which stature formulas were used? Trotter and Gleaser, or weekend guess and stretch? Did soil movement distort lengths? You also keep a translator handy. Ancient words rendered as giant can mean mighty, renowned, or simply big deal, which is not the same as 10 feet tall. Before you leave the cave, you look outward one more time. Dawn cuts a thin seam on the horizon, and the grass smells of iron and crushed sage. Behind you, the painted herd keeps slipping forward in the flicker, reminding you that distance and scale are slippery things. You promise yourself compassion as a final rule. Real people with medical gigantism have lived and do live. Their bones and biographies deserve care, not spectacle. Tonight, you'll walk a middle path, skeptical but curious, amused but kind. You square your shoulders. Run through your checklist bones first context, always math without mercy. Language with care, and step into the long corridor of time. The question is tall. The evidence is taller in a different way. Keep your voice low. Keep your torch steady. When the ground hums with something huge, you'll ask if it's an animal, a story, or a human whose shadow grew in the telling, and you'll let the bones answer one careful millimeter at a time. You're ankle deep in spring furrows when the plowshare grinds kicks and the mule lurches as if it just discovered philosophy. You kneel to clear the dirt, and there it is, chalk white, rounded and staring with one cavernous hole in the middle of the face. The village bell will have opinions about this. The baker will swear it's a giant's skull. The blacksmith will say it belongs to a volcano goblin. The miller will try to buy it for a bar sign. You run your fingers over the bone and feel the trick that eye is not an eye at all, just the huge nasal opening where a trunk once rooted to flesh. Without tusks, without the lower jaw, a proboscidean skull elephant mammoth mastodon does a perfect Cyclops impression. Joke one nature invented the Halloween mask ages before the party store. You tilt the skull, and the true orbit's small, real eyes sit off to the sides, shy as wallflowers. Now turn the map in your head to Sicily and the islands that fleck the Mediterranean like crumbs on a blue tablecloth. During the Pleistocene, those islands hosted dwarf elephants, insular cousins of mainland giants, shrunk by island ecology to pony size. When their skulls eroded out of caves, the nose socket looked like a single huge eye. Travelers with minds full of Homer and trade winds of rumor could stitch that sight to old stories. That's your mainstream anchor tonight. Island dwarf elephants think Paleoloxodon were real. Their skulls really do have a central void. And Sicily is where Homer parked the Cyclops Polyphemus. You can almost see a shepherd boy holding a chalky skull up to a friend and saying, "Told you so," while Mount Etna exhales behind them like a giant soup pot. Historians still argue whether those skulls were the primary spark for Cyclops tales, or just handy props that later storytellers waved like stage gobos. Another camp points to the volcanic smith god's Hephaestus and his one-eyed crew hammering under mountains, suggesting Cyclopes began as mythic craftsmen, with the eye a symbol of focused sight rather than literal anatomy. Yet another angle follows one-eyed afflictions and battlefield injuries, asking whether lived encounters with men missing an eye fed the image. Your job isn't to banish any of that. It's to watch how bones, landscapes, and jobs whisper to stories until the whispers harmonize. Back to the field. You rope a few neighbors into lifting the thing. Someone measures their forearm against the eye and does quick math. 10 feet tall at least. Joke 2 village math converts curiosity into extra feet, the way bakers convert flour into free samples. That leap from big hole to giant human feels natural. People pace the world by bodies, so they scale mysteries with their own limbs. No one in this furrow has a comparative anatomy chart. The sea traders don't carry skull diagrams, they carry pepper. So the story travels faster than correction. Slide your attention across centuries and oceans. In riverbanks of North America, farmers and hunters turned up mastodon molars, pebbled mountains of enamel and femora, heavy enough to suggest titans. 18th century naturalists called this creature the American incognitum, and for a while some argued enormous humans might have walked the interior forests. It took comparative anatomists like Cuvier to say, "That tooth is not human." Also, please stop giving your museum a hernia. The serious point, tuck it beside your torch, is that without context, the layer, the associated species, the toolkit nearby, a single spectacular bone tips stories toward giants. Medieval Europe knew how to display a whopper. Whale ribs hung in churches as the bones of saints or dragons. Cave bear femora became relics of ancestral strong men. A mainstream fact with a candle of irony before paleontology had a name, many communities already had museums just called nave crypt or market hall. A quirky tidbit to savor: in parts of Asia, fossil bones were ground into dragon bone powder for traditional medicine. In parts of Europe, unicorn horn narwhal tusk guarded against poison at royal tables. When you're hunting giants, remember that natural history once passed through kitchens and pharmacies as often as through libraries. You gently tap the skull again and imagine how it washed into the furrow. Caves collapse, rains carry sediments. Farmers cut new canals and bones wander like reteries with train passes. By the time your plow hits one, the original bed, the layer that dated it and named its neighbors, might be gone. A detached skull is a plot twist without the earlier chapters. That's how you get village verdicts like giant ogre or saint who forgot leg day. If you're lucky, you find more tusks. Limb bones may be a tooth as ridged as a washboard. If you're really lucky, you find them in place, sleeping in orderly strata. You map the Cyclops mechanics in your head like a bedtime diagram. Step 1, island, elephants die in caves. Step 2, rockfall and water shuffle the skeleton. Step 3, skull sheds tusks and jaw. Step 4, erosion gifts a farmer a haunting mask. Step 5, story alchemizes bone into biography. Add Etna's booming to the background, and you've got mythic acoustics. It's no wonder Homer's Cyclops lives there. Giants love good sound design. Joke 3, if you had a volcano for a subwoofer, you'd monologue too. Now give your skeptical side a cookie. Could villagers really mistake an elephant skull for a human? Stand a few meters away smear a little mud, and strip modern categories out of your head. Yes, the scale dwarfs your expectations. The central aperture reads as face. The absence of familiar human sutures blurs into the other. Your earlier rule bones beat anecdote still holds, but you remember that interpretation is a human sport, and we play it with the equipment we have. Fold in another mainstream fact early. Greek travelers placed the Cyclopes in several locations, Sicily. Yes, but also places associated with forges and caves. Political geography rides shotgun in myth. Tales follow trade. If you were carving a cargo of spooky stories to value-add your olive oil, we saw the skull of a one-eyed giant by the mountain of fire would ship well. Historians still argue whether seafarers reused a flexible template giant cave sheep bad hospitality, or whether local finds repeatedly refueled the same archetype. Your fingertips remember the math from the cave scale, a human to match that skull, and the square cube law files a complaint. The femora you'd need to keep that thing ambulatory would be tree thick. The heart would pump as if climbing stairs forever. The skin would struggle to shed heat in Mediterranean summers. Real elephants solve those problems with 4 columns for legs, a different chest shape, and ears that act like radiators. Human bipedalism doesn't play as nicely at that size without orthopedic drama. The baker shrugs at your physics. Still looks like an eye proof that a good story rises like bread even when your equations are flat. You wrap the skull with burlap and tuck it in the barn next to a jar of pickles and a sense that the world is stranger than yesterday by exactly 1 head. Tonight you'll take a lantern to the hill and look toward Etna, watching orange filaments run up the dark like someone's pulling stitches in the sky. You'll remember the cave hands from earlier, their palms opening and closing on the rock, and you'll realize that across millennia, people keep trying to touch size itself. Sometimes they touch it in gleaming ivory and call it a giant, sometimes in equations and call it a limit. By morning, a traveling friar will stop, bless the find, and suggest it once belonged to a towering saint who guarded sheep with 1 watchful eye. A fisherman will counter with a sea monster. You'll make tea and set both stories on the table, then walk back to the skull with your tape and notebook. Even when legends grow like vines, the stone wall is still there underneath. You'll measure the nasal aperture, mark the zygomatic arches, and note the smooth dome of the cranium, each detail nudging the bone from myth back toward the animal it once was. Hold both truths gently. Villagers weren't foolish to see a giant in that face. They were attentive to what their senses told them and creative with the gaps. You standing in their field with a little more anatomy in your pockets can honor the wonder while sorting the parts. The skull isn't a lie, it's a lens. Turn it one way and you meet Polyphemus. Turn it the other, and a small island elephant peers back from an Ice Age meadow trunk. Curled ears flicking against flies, as real as the mule tugging the plow. You leave the furrowed field and follow tracks in damp loam, broad oval cups that hold last night's rain like tiny mirrors. Tonight you meet giants that truly are giant, just not human. The megafauna that walked beside your ancestors breathed the same dust and quietly fed the world's biggest stories. Across a wind-streaked steppe, the ground shivers not with a 12-foot spear thrower, but with an elephant cousin moving like a woolly hill with opinions. Start with a clear peg for your hat. Mammoths are recent enough to feel like neighbors. Most herds fade by about 10,000 years ago, yet a dwarf population on Wrangel Island survives until roughly 4,000 years ago. If you could time hop to pyramid-building Egypt, you could detour north and hear a mammoth sneeze behind sea ice. Folklore doesn't need to invent giants out of thin air when shaggy mountains on legs graze within rumor's reach. You kneel at a riverbank where a tusk uncoils from clay, banded like a tree's calendar. Haul it into a village, stand it by the door, and watch the label drift toward giant's rib. Joke one you could hang laundry on it and still have room for Tuesday's regrets. That reflex isn't foolish. It's human. Without textbooks, you compare the unknown to the only skeleton you know your own, and scale up accordingly. Turn the map south to the pampas of South America. Brush dust from a pelvis big enough to serve stew to a football team, and meet Megatherium, the giant ground sloth, elephant-length, clawed like garden rakes a slow bulldozer of woodland edges. Those scything claws are mostly for hooking branches and defense, not for horror movie antics. Still imagine a single talon eroding out of a cliff. In one afternoon it becomes a giant's fingernail, and a fireside tale grows calluses. Historians still argue whether oral memories of mammoths and giant sloths lasted long enough to braid into early stories of giants, or whether the tales are symbolic and the fossils only cameo. Either way, the ingredients are perfect, alarming size, unfamiliar anatomy, and bones that wander. Rivers roll femora like driftwood. Frost heave works skulls toward daylight. Roots lever tusks into the open like white punctuation. One bone in the right hand staffs a whole parade. Swing to Australia, where heat walks on its hands and the horizon wobbles. Meet Diprotodon, a bare big cousin of the wombat, and Procoptodon, a short-faced kangaroo thick as a prize-fighter, tall enough to make you rethink eye contact. Trackways ancient footprints baked into stone map herds that pause and cluster choreography in mud. Across the continent, Aboriginal stories speak of powerful beings at waterholes and billabongs. Some researchers hear blurred memories of extinct animals. Others hear morality plays about respect for country. Both readings keep you humble because bones and stories often share a waterhole. Now the high grass of North America ripples like fur. A shadow glides over you, wings like a sail, silence like a secret. Thunderbirds beat through stories. Paleontology offers teratorns and giant condors' wingspans over 5 meters, the sky's own hang gliders. Below creeks surrender mastodon teeth, and early museums swell with giant ribs and mystery bones. Joke too, every new museum needs a spooky roommate until the labels catch up. Naturalists eventually sort mammoth from mastodon cousins, not twins, and teach a public hungry for wonder that bigness comes in many blueprints. Europe brings chandeliers and carnivores, cave bears packed alpine caverns, cave lions padded through snow on paws like quiet drums, and the Irish elk Megaloceros grew antlers that could span 12 feet across in some bulls, a measurement your ceiling joists would resent. Picture a farmer hauling that rack home and a monk jotting relic of a giant. He isn't lying. He's translating scale into a language congregations understand. Another heavyweight arrives with armored manners, Glyptodon, a Volkswagen-sized armadillo with a domed shell and sometimes a spiked tail club. Modern imaginations have proposed its carapace as a prehistoric roof. Did anyone actually shelter under one? Probably not often, but the image sticks. Quirky tidbit to pocket beside it. Thomas Jefferson kept fossil bones mastodon among them at the president's house, and once misread a giant ground sloth fossil as a fearsome great claw cheerfully fueling dinner table debates about what monsters still might roam the American interior. Joke 3. The White House once had bigger bones than some museums talk about executive privilege. Threaded through all this is disappearance. The Ice Age ends in climate whiplash, warming, wetting, drying, while human hunting spreads with clever tools and hungry families. Many megafauna vanish on a timetable that makes you uneasy. Historians still argue whether the extinctions were driven mostly by climate change, by human overhunting the overkill hypothesis, or by a duet of both. Your job isn't to pick a team under the stars. It's to notice that absence leaves a vacancy into which cultures pour caution pride and the outline of a giant. Farther east, and later in time, you walk the ferny valleys of Aotearoa, New Zealand. Moa giant flightless birds once stalked these paths. Above them ruled Haast's eagle talons, like hand tools, a raptor powerful enough to seize a person. Maori traditions tell of a monstrous pauakai. Look up from the valley floor, and you understand how a shadow becomes law. Don't wander alone. Respect the ranges. Subfossil bones reach European hands, still clean enough to pass at dinner, the past so fresh it smudges your fingers. Keep a hand on practicality, because that is where stories change jackets. A mammoth rib displayed in a chapel as a giant's thigh. A sloth claw mislabeled giant's nail in a courthouse drawer. A kangaroo femur riding into a frontier cabinet as relic of Titan. Each is a breadcrumb on a path where megafauna and giant trade places whenever context snaps. You don't have to mock those old labels to do better. They worked with muddy boots and no textbooks. You work with databases. Measure gently, relabel clearly, keep the wonder. By midnight, the stars lean closer as if they want a better look at your notes. Keep a simple habit. Whenever a culture tells you about giants, listen underneath for animal footfalls. Mammoth breath turns to fog in your imagination. Terratorn wings tilt morning into shade. The bunyip's growl may rumble from a waterhole where a diprotodon once sank. None of this kills the magic. It locates it. Sometimes a giant is grief in a costume. Sometimes it is a literal shell washed from a bank. You glance back along the path from the Cyclops skull's deceptive eye to Wrangle's last shaggy holdouts and feel a useful truth settle. Prehistory isn't trying to trick you, it's handing you a library card. The script is tusk and antler, claw and shell. The grammar is river frost and time. Translate carefully, and you keep both poem and data. Translate lazily, and you wake with a hangover called 10-foot ancestors. You're not here to scold the past. You're here to tuck it in and read it well before you sleep. You leave the wind-brushed step and slip under a canopy where light breaks into green coins. The air smells of wet bark and bamboo sugar, and everything creaks softly as if the forest is doing yoga. Here the giant you're hunting is not a human at all, but the heaviest ape that ever shouldered through leaves Gigantopithecus. You don't meet a towering caveman. You meet a shadow with very large teeth. Your first clue isn't a skull on a plow, it's a molar in a jar. In the 1930s, a researcher browsing Chinese apothecaries' shops that sold powdered dragon bones as medicine noticed some teeth far too big for a person and too flat for a carnivore. He bought them, measured them, and gave a lost animal back its name. That's your mainstream peg Gigantopithecus is known almost entirely from teeth and bits of lower jaw recovered from cave deposits across southern China and mainland Southeast Asia, dating roughly from 2 million down to a few 100,000 years ago. You hold a molar the size of a walnut and feel the thrill of scale. This is the kind of tooth that comes with its own dental plan. Joke 1, if your toothbrush needs a shoulder strap, you might be brushing a Gigantopithecus. Teeth are tiny biographies. Flat, broad, chewing surfaces and thick enamel hint at a diet of tough plants, think fibrous fruits. Roots may be bamboo culms when times got lean. Under microscopes, microscopic scratches and pits, the tooth's travel diary suggest heavy grinding duty. Not a saber-toothed monster, more of a botanical bulldozer. Historians still argue whether Gigantopithecus specialized on bamboo, like a panda, or browsed a wider menu of forest foods and only leaned into bamboo when fruit failed. Either way, you slice the salad. This is a forest animal, a bulk feeder that needs leaves, like a furnace needs wood. Put the tooth back and step to the jaw. The fragments that survive are massive U-shaped arcs with deep roots. From these, and from comparisons to living apes, researchers estimate body size, but estimates have range. Conservative models put big males in the several hundred-kilogram club. Bolder ones let them graze the 400 to 500-kilogram line. There's honest wobble here because translating tooth into torso is like guessing a house plan from a doorknob. You can sketch the neighborhood, not the closet shelving. What you can say with confidence is that Gigantopithecus is the largest primate we know, gorilla-sized, and then some, yet everything about its tools screams plant chewer, not spear maker. Now the relationship question. For a long time, the shape of those teeth nudged scientists toward orangutans as the closest living relatives. More recently, preserved proteins in the enamel molecular breadcrumbs that survive when DNA does not reinforce that family tie, pointing to a deep split between the line that would become modern orangutans and the line that became this ground-shaking browser millions of years ago. That's another mainstream anchor for your pocket. Gigantopithecus is a pongine cousin to orangutans, not a human ancestor. It doesn't form a secret human side branch. It grows from a different trunk altogether. So how did it move? Picture an orangutan that lost its ladder of strong branches. At that size, arboreal acrobatics are risky. The forest is more pantry than playground. The safest bet is that Gigantopithecus spent most of its time on or near the ground in dense woodlands, probably walking with a forward-leaning, knuckle-supported gait when it needed to cover distance and sitting to feed for long stretches. Upright walking like yours would be short, occasional, and awkward. The notion of a 12-foot forest man striding like a basketball center through bamboo thickets makes good campfire silhouette, but bad biomechanics. Your light slides across the forest floor and catches other bones, stegodons, deer, porcupines, species found alongside Gigantopithecus in cave deposits. Those caves are their own storytellers. Some were natural traps. Some were dens where hyenas dragged bones to chew in company. Some collected remains washed in by seasonal floods. This matters because a cave that mixes species can play pranks on anyone eager to assemble a giant from whatever's handy. Remember your earlier rule, one creature, one set. In bone, jigsaw puzzles forcing a fit creates monsters. Zoom out to its world. The Pleistocene climate flickers cooler, warmer, wetter, drier, and forests expand and contract like lungs. When broadleaf and bamboo forests thrive, a bulk-feeding ape finds a buffet. When forests shrink, the same ape finds a treadmill of hunger. Historians still argue whether climate-driven habitat loss alone doomed Gigantopithecus, or whether competition pressured it too, maybe from other large herbivores, maybe later from adaptable Homo species, sampling similar fruits at forest edges. The timeline whispers that by the time your species arrives in force in Southeast Asia, Gigantopithecus is probably already gone. If there were encounters, they would likely have been with earlier Homo travelers. Either way, the end is quiet. No spear points stuck in ribs, just a diet that gets patchy, and a body too specialized to pivot. Now for the fringe shadow that always follows a large footprint. Because Gigantopithecus was real, and its bones are huge, a few modern storytellers wave its name as the true identity of big, hairy hominins reported from mountains and backwoods. It's a tidy idea the giant ape never died out. It went shy. The problems are practical. An animal this big needs a lot of calories and leaves a lot of sign-scat carcasses. Bones clear DNA in hair and skin left on snags, and it needs viable populations to avoid inbreeding. Forests near people are loud with cameras now. If a remnant population of half-ton apes was stomping around your phone, would probably have met one before your bedtime podcast did. Joke 2, the only thing that hides that well today is your last matching sock. The real story, though less dramatic, is more beautiful. Those giant teeth keep telling you about a forest thick with seasonal rhythms, fruiting trees that draw animals like festivals, bamboo that spikes and flowers on strange schedules, corridors of shade where big bodies can stay cool. An ape adapted to this pantry would live close to water, avoid open grass, and tune its ear to leaves, not migrations. It is not a mythic builder of stone circles. It is a patient eater with the jaw for it. A quirky tidbit to tuck beside your lantern, a few of those teeth reached science because someone first ground similar fossils into dragon bone remedies. Your earlier callback rises like steam. Old medicine cabinets doubled as fossil cabinets, and sometimes the pharmacist was the first paleontologist in the room. And what about the dream of a human giant? You feel it tug again. Surely an animal this big could stand upright and loom. Stand a minute with physics. Scale a human frame to that mass, and the square cube law starts handing out citations for joint overload and overheating. Apes solve weight with posture and limb proportions you do not share. Gigantopithecus handles mass by being an ape differently shaped from you. It does not handle it by becoming you plus 3 feet. Joke 3, you can't fix engineering by adding now with 30% more human. Before you leave the bamboo dusk, scoop one more mainstream fact into your pocket because we lack skulls and limb bones. Reconstructions you see in museums vary wildly. Some draw a shaggy orangutan scaled up, some a gorilla with extra vitamins, some, unfortunately, a cartoon caveman. The honest answer is a big, ground-friendly ape in a forest that keeps breathing in and out. You trace your finger over the molar again and feel how much a single tooth can carry, diet, habitat, family, and the limit of what you're allowed to claim. Teeth are nature's black boxes, no beeping, but full of flight data if you read them slowly. You step back into brighter air, eyes adjusting from green to gold. Behind you, something huge cracks a stalk and settles to chew. No roar, no spear, just patient grinding like rain on a leaf roof. Your question tonight isn't whether a human giant hid here. It's what this real giant ape tells you about the forests that cradled hominins nearby. Pockets of shade, calendars of fruit, shelters that shaped the choices of your smaller-bodied ancestors. When you later hear a campfire story about a towering man of the woods, you'll remember the molar in the jar and the bamboo whispering. And you'll ask gently, which giant are we really missing? The one in our shape, or the one whose teeth we still keep in a folded paper envelope, heavy as a secret? You step out of bamboo shade and onto a high, open terrace where wind combs the grass into long green ripples. Tonight you aren't chasing Cyclops skull illusions or forest apes with secret molars. You're checking the tape measure on your own family Neanderthals, Homo heidelbergensis, and early Homo sapiens, and asking how climate, diet, and tools nudge stature up or down. Your breath goes easy in the cool air, and the ground under your boots feels like a balance beam between physics and food. Start with a body you can picture Neanderthals. You don't meet a front line of basketball centers. You meet champions of compact power. Average adult males hover somewhere around the mid-160s in centimeters, females a little below that, but height is the most boring part of the silhouette. What wakes you up is proportion barrel chests for volume shortened forearms, and shins to save heat, thick cortical bone, and joint surfaces that look ready for a life of hauling, thrusting, and bracing. That outline hums the winter rules Bergmans and Allens, where cold climates reward stockier bodies that conserve warmth. Call it the space heater build. Joke 1, if a Neanderthal gave you a hug, you'd probably heat your house for a week. Height isn't everything. Mass matters. A 1.65-meter Neanderthal could outweigh a taller, lankier human because of that deep torso and heavy limb bones. Their tools, scrapers, hafted points, sturdy spears fit a strategy where many calories arrived by close-range hunting and heavy butchery in cold wind. In that world, short distal limbs aren't shortcomings. They're accident insurance for fingers and levers. Historians still argue whether their compact form came mostly from deep time in glacial Europe or repeated plastic responses to cold during development. Either way, you read climate in bone, like you read wind in grass, and you see how body plans get tuned before anyone picks up a sewing needle. Now you pivot to Homo heidelbergensis, the mid-Pleistocene cousins, who set some structural beams for both Neanderthals and you. Complete skeletons are rare, but the fragments you do have suggest tall, robust frames. Many males likely around 1.70 to 1.75 meters, when well fed with broad shoulders and strong legs. These folks lived through advancing colds, and fitful thaws ranged across Africa and into Europe. And this is your mainstream anchor, left behind wooden hunting spears at Schöningen that show planned big game strategies hundreds of thousands of years ago. Tools like that turn calories from a gamble into a schedule. On a good schedule, kids grow closer to the height the blueprint allows. Walk forward again to early Homo sapiens. In the African record, and then in Upper Paleolithic Eurasia, you often meet people as tall as many modern populations. Longer limbs in hot places where shedding heat matters more. Moderate builds in cooler regions. Some individuals brush or top. 80 meters, though, averages hover lower. Why not a secret giant gene, but shameless menu variety and social buffering? Shell middens climb like bookshelves, fish bones glitter, charred tubers and ground seeds whisper of starch on purpose. Cooking, already an old friend, squeezes more energy from plants and meat alike. Joke 2. The paleo diet apparently included porridge nights. Please don't tell the steak-only crowd. If height is a biography of childhood, teeth are the bibliography. Enamel hypoplasia. Those faint lines and pits records pauses in growth from disease or hunger. Lay Neanderthal and early sapiens teeth side by side, and you'll sometimes see the same stress bars. Harsh years tax all bodies. But in places where fishing, storage, and trade smooth the calendar, early sapiens kids hit fewer red lights, and adults end up taller. A quirky tidbit to tuck in your pocket: chemical residues and rock art at some sites hint at deliberate honey-raiding sweet calories that turn on small bodies like sunrise in winter. Historians still argue whether the particularly tall statures in some upper Paleolithic cemeteries reflect richer diets and lower disease loads, or sampling bias that overrepresents robust individuals in fancy burials. Climate writes notes in bone proportions. Long limbs radiate heat, short limbs conserve it. That's why a warm savanna early sapiens reads like a marathon poster, while a cold steppe Neanderthal reads like a cast-iron stove. But tools let you cheat a little. The appearance of eyed, needles-fitted clothing, wind-tight shelters, and hearths you can count on loosens climate's cuffs on the body. A lankier frame can now live where it would otherwise shiver and stall because a hood, a seam, and a fire do quiet hero work. Food tech echoes the same tune. Better blade production and sharing networks keep the pantry open longer, the growth plates open longer, and the final stature closer to plan. Joke 3. The most underrated growth supplement of the Pleistocene was: Mom says dinner is on time. Heidelbergensis sits behind both lineages like an older cousin with practical advice. Those Schöningen spears whisper, you don't need to be a giant if you plan like one. Add control of fire and likely shelters, and you get the bigger story. When you buffer seasons, you buffer growth. Taller children appear not because someone rolled a mythical tallness allele, but because dinners stopped ghosting them each January. Change the logistics and the biology follows along quietly like a well-trained sled dog. You kneel by a Neanderthal femur again and compare it to an early sapiens femur from the same latitude. The Neanderthal shaft is thicker, the medullary cavity narrower, the overall length often a touch shorter. Same assignment. Different strategies turn. Landscape into warmth and calories. Habit leaves fingerprints on bone. Frequent close-range thrusting builds, shoulders like cart axles. Long-distance foraging and fishing stretch stride and lighten frames. and a small weirdness to smile at some Neanderthals show surfers' ear bony growths in the ear canal, likely from frequent cold water exposure, perhaps diving for resources along coasts or rivers. It's a footnote that hints at shoreline calories, quietly nudging stature upward where the sea helped fill the pantry. Step back, and the graph of stature stops looking like a staircase to the heavens and starts looking like a tide chart. In regions where farming later replaces foraging, average stature often dips for a while, monocrops crowding and barnyard diseases team up on growth plates before rebounding. Centuries later, with diversified diets and trade. We're not there yet in tonight's timeline, but you can feel the lesson already. Height is a social technology as much as a genetic lottery. Shift what and how you eat, share, and store, and the yardstick moves without consulting your myths. Before you leave the terrace, you hear a familiar throat clearing, our friend the square cube law. Human bipedalism scales nicely inside a certain band. Push too high, and joints start filing complaint tickets. Hearts work overtime against gravity, and dumping heat becomes a full-time job. That's why the record shows healthy, tall individuals rather than tribes of 10-foot spear throwers. A very tall burial is a postcard from a childhood that went right, not a census of a lost giant race. And if your neighbor tries to fold a mammoth rib into the story as a human thigh again, you can smile, remember Wrangell's dwarfed mammoths from last night's walk, and gently redirect them to the correct skeleton. You rise, pat the pocket with your needle scrapers and a saved wedge of honeycomb, and aim yourself toward the next campfire. Heights ripple across time like the grass at your feet. Climate-pushing tools, loosening diets, feeding, and every rib, femur, and tooth you've met tonight keeps saying the same sleepy thing. Not a world of titans, but of finely tuned bodies reading weather and recipes. You trudge on amused, a little humbled, and absolutely certain that if a true 12-footer tried to duck into your cave, your ankles and the square cube law would file for immediate leave. You angle east into dry hills shaped like sleeping camels, and climb a tell where potsherds chime under your boots. The wind smells of dust and olives, and tonight, your giants walk out of ink. Not bone, the Nephilim and the Rephaim words that make comment sections behave like hornet nests. You spread an imaginary scroll across your knees and read slowly, because in this landscape one vowel can grow a foot. Start with the term that launches 1,000 thumbnails, Nephilim. You meet them first in a few compact words. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days. A line so short you could stitch it on a pillow and still have room for second breakfast. The Hebrew root can mean fallen those who fell, or those who cause others to fall, depending on who's holding the grammar. When the text went into ancient Greek, translators reached for gigantes, a word that in Greek myth doesn't mean really tall dude so much as earth-born striver. Joke one gigantes is not a scouting report for the ancient NB that mainstream peg matters. The biblical giant arrives through a translation door, where size and symbolism sit in the same chair. Turn a few columns, and you meet the Nephilim again in the spy's report from Canaan. We looked like grasshoppers to ourselves. That's theater, not measurement. You've got the yardstick from earlier in your pocket, and it doesn't have grasshopper units. The rhetorical move is clear: exaggerate the threat to justify retreat. Historians still argue whether the Genesis line connects to that later panic, or whether the two uses preserve different traditions, braided by an editor with opinions and limited coffee. Next word on your lantern's beam, Rephaim. Here things fork like a desert track at dusk. In some passages, Rephaim names shadowy, dead ancestral shades in the underworld, matching echoes from Ugaritic texts, where the Apum are royal ancestors feasted in ritual. In others, Rephaim labels ancient peoples of Transjordan neighbors with reputations for bigness, alongside Anakim Emim and Zamzumim. Same syllables, different addresses. If you're looking for a single giant tribe, the text taps the brakes and pours you a glass of ambiguity. Then comes the star of campfire fame, King Og of Bashan. One tidy verse says his bedstead on display at Rabbah measures 9 cubits by 4. Depending on your cubit, they vary like phone chargers. That's roughly 4 meters by almost 2, a California king of Bashan, if you will. Do you instantly award Og a 9-cubit height? Not so fast. The word for bed can also mean couch or bier. The iron might be literal metal or a poetic tag for black basalt common in that region. The display at Rabbah reads like a war trophy. Look what we took, not a medical chart. Quirky tidbit for your pocket 19th century travelers around the Golan used to point at basalt dolmens and call them giants' beds, happily matching rock furniture to old verses. Joke 2. Bed Bath and Bashan would be a dangerous store for impulse buyers. You look up from the scroll and down into the ground. What do the layers say in Iron Age Levantine cemeteries? Typical adult male heights cluster much like many pre-industrial populations worldwide, often somewhere around 160 to 100 with the usual nutritional spread. Weapons and armor scale to normal human hands. You don't hit orderly strata of 10-foot skeletons. You hit the usual neighborhood of Bronze and Iron Age bones, plus plenty of donkeys who never once bragged online. That's your mainstream anchor archaeology in this region has not produced verified populations of truly gigantic humans. The square cube law, remember that grumpy bouncer from earlier, still stands at the door, arms folded. Yet the text keeps handing you puzzles more interesting than simple yes or no. Goliath walks on stage with 2 possible heights depending on manuscript family. One says 6 cubits and a span. The famous nearly 10 feet, another earliest strand. The Dead Sea Scrolls, and some Septuagint witnesses, say 4 cubits and a span closer to 6'9", which is still very tall in that world, and well within biology. Historians still argue whether the taller reading is a later inflation for drama, or the shorter one a conservative correction from scribes who liked plausibility with their poetry. Either way, the fight reads as a mismatch in status and bravado, more than a nature documentary about a giant. You run a finger along more names Anakim here, Zamzumim there, and you see how border stories work. Giants at the edges of your map serve many jobs. They explain abandoned megaliths. They warn children not to wander. They make your ancestors look brave by contrast. On the Golan and into Bashan, megalithic circles and dolmen fields dot the basalt like lost game boards. Communities long after their builders walked by asked who could lift that and filed giants as the answer because cranes were not on the menu. Archaeology now reads those stones as the work of normal-sized Bronze Age people with patience ropes, rollers, and more neighbors than you've invited to help you move house. The Dead Sea Scrolls add spice without filling the pot. Alongside biblical books, the caves gave up fragments of a book of giants, a wild expansion of early traditions where hybrid beings stomp around like a moral warning turned up to 11. The community at Qumran copied and chewed on such stories because they were part of a larger conversation about cosmic order and human revolt, not because somebody found a femur too big for the male. Your callback from earlier returns. Myths are memory theaters. They do theology, politics, and law while wearing costumes borrowed from bone storms and neighbor gossip. So what can you safely carry out of this section without snapping the strap? One mainstream fact. Nephilim and Rephaim sits are sparse, tricky words with multiple meanings in the Hebrew Bible. Greek translators gigantes steered later readers toward giant, whereas the underlying terms don't always demand unusual stature. Another Og's famous bed is a measured object in a foreign city trophy furniture, not a radiograph, and giants at the borders often label ancientness threat or prestige. A third archaeology in the Levant has not uncovered a separate species or population of super-tall humans. The skeletons match the expected range. Now your open question whispered like wind under a tent flap. Historians still argue whether the Genesis sons of God and the resulting Nephilim reflect a myth of divine beings and human women, a polemic about tyrant kings collecting wives, or a stew of both layered by editors. They also argue whether references to Rephaim as the dead shaped later readings of giants in Transjordan, turning ancestral cult vocabulary into ethnography by accident. You don't need to settle it by midnight, you just need to keep the categories from spilling into each other like soup in a sandstorm. Your jokes keep you honest. The Spies We Are Grasshoppers is not peer-reviewed metrology. Og's iron can be basalt, and even if it's actual iron, it's still furniture, not a selfie. And Gigantes, however cool it sounds, is not a magic enlarger. Joke 3, if translating a word into Greek added 2 feet, someone would have done it to their height on their dating profile by now. Before you fold the scroll, you glance north across the black rock plateau of Bashan, where dolmens squat like low thunderheads. And remember your rule from the cave bones: beat anecdotes and context is king. If tomorrow you trowel up a grave of an unusually tall Iron Age individual, you will document, measure, and nod. You won't promote one skeleton into a lost nation. And when a guide waves at a megalith and says, "Giants slept there," you'll smile, honor the poetry, and also sketch ropes, teams, and patient winter days when the ground was hard enough to haul. You brush grit from your knees, tuck the yardstick back into your pocket beside the memory of Gigantopithecus's molar, and the Cyclops nose socket, and head down the tell. The text murmurs behind you, layered and alive. Out here, giants are as often metaphors and trophies as measurements, and that makes them better bedtime company anyway. They ask you to read carefully, to let mythology share a table with archaeology, and to remember that not every big story needs a bigger skeleton. You ride the ferry across a blue sheet of Aegean glass and step onto a sun-struck quay where olives shine like polished buttons. Giants meet you here not in bone, but in chorus painted on vases carved on temple metopes roaring from amphitheaters. You tilt your head at the word gigantes and feel the ground warm earthborn strivers against the gods, sometimes with serpent tails instead of calves. That's your mainstream Peg Hesiod, and the painters after him don't sketch a nation of very tall humans. They stage a cosmic brawl, the Gigantomachy, where order hurls lightning at upheaval. The Cyclopes in this world are not farm-raiding brutes, but master smiths below volcanoes forging Zeus's thunderbolt in a workshop that sounds like Etna breathing. Joke 1, if your metal shop doubles as a volcano, your OSHA poster is just a shrug. You walk the Stoa and read how the Greeks kept giant bones in hero shrines, vast femora displayed as proofs of ancient protectors. Centuries later, many of those hero bones turn out to be whale ribs or mammoth bits. You can almost see the process. A storm coughs up a rib onto a rocky beach. A priest recognizes a chance to anchor local pride. A storyteller gives the relic a biography, and a city gains a guardian taller than its walls. Your earlier Cyclops skull lesson nods along misplaced anatomy plus good theater equals very convincing giants. You lean into shade and listen to one shepherd's tale morph into Homer's. Polyphemus shambles out of the cave, one-eyed and inhospitable, but listen past the wine and the goat smell, and you hear island geology humming. The Cyclopes forge under mountains, the ash, the glowing vents. If you lived under a volcano, you'd imagine subterranean craftsmen too. Historians still argue whether the one eye of the Cyclops came mainly from elephant skull's nasal cavities, fooling coastal diggers from the blazing vent of a forge, stylized as a single eye, or from a collage of both carried by sailors who traded stories as seriously as grain. You hop north by map and temperature until your breath fogs and fjords carve mirrors into stone. In the sagas, the beings you meet are jötnar, often translated giants, but really a larger category of eaters, devourers, old powers that predate and contend with the gods. They're not just big, they are other frost mountain night, the raw materials of a world still cooling. The prose Edda tells you the cosmos rises from Ymir's sundered body, flesh to earth, bones to mountains, blood to sea, an image so vast it quiets your boots. Here Giant is scaffolding for cosmology, not a census of tall neighbors. You let your gaze climb a wall of hexagonal basalt, and remember another coast, the Giant's Causeway in Ireland, where folklore gives you Finn McCool, striding to Scotland on a tidy stone bridge. The mainstream fact is geology. Lava cooled slowly, cracked into tidy columns, and the sea sheared them into steps. But the name shows the reflex you've seen all night. When the land wears an impossible pattern, you reach for a body big enough to lay it down. Joke 2 free 2-day shipping for those columns, courtesy of the Department of Giant Logistics. Turn back to Scandinavia's boulders marooned in meadows miles from any cliff. Glaciers once delivered these erratics like surprise furniture in the wrong room. Folklore says a giant hurled them at a church he didn't like and missed. You smile because it's perfect faith and land use wrapped into a stone with a travel history, the moral etched on the side by moss. A quirky tidbit in some parishes, people named individual stones after feuding giants, local gossip recast at boulder scale. Your callback to misread thunderstones returns too. Neolithic axes were kept as lightning charms on hearths. Zeus's lost hardware rebranded as protection. Inside the sagas, giants and gods marry, bargain and betray. The borders are porous even when the battles are loud. Thor fights Hrungnir, a Jotun of stone. Later he borrows a peasant boy's goats and takes a nap at a farmer's house. Size slips, meaning widens. Historians still argue whether jötnar encode pre-Christian nature deities domesticated by later storytellers, or whether they're narrative masks for human outgroups at the edges. Sami hunters rival tribes, the wilderness itself made large and dangerous in the telling. Some trace family resemblances across Indo-European myth, a deep grammar whispering order versus wild in many languages. Others caution that we flatten rich local traditions when we reach too fast for a single ancestor tale. Your yardstick stays in your pocket on purpose. When a verse says mountain high, it winks. When Thor drinks from a horn connected to the sea and lowers the level of the ocean in one pull, you're not supposed to graph it. Myth here flexes to explain weather luck, the ethics of oaths, the sabotage of pride. Still, your science brain can't resist peeking under the stage. A rockfall becomes a giant's footprint. A scree slope becomes a bed. People knit landscape into story so children can remember it, avoid that cliff respect that river don't boast on your way to the market. Back in the Mediterranean vase, painters crowd giants into battle scenes. Athena drives a spear, the earth cracks, serpent legs coil. The iconography is crisp because artists need clarity in a swirl of limbs. In those same centuries, philosophers discuss nature law and the city. The Gigantomachy on temple walls becomes political shorthand order, triumphing over uprising. Your earlier bed from Bashan looks less lonely now. Furniture bones and boulders all serve as message boards for identity. The giants you're offered are as much about we as about big. You stop at a museum case and press your forehead to the glass. Inside lies a dinosaur footprint from southern Europe that once sat for decades in a village square as Hercules' sandal mark. The mainstream fact you pocket, classical and medieval observers often reinterpreted dinosaur tracks and fossil trees as remnants of heroes and monsters, perfectly reasonable when you don't know about Mesozoic mudflats. Your Cyclops skull, your hero femur, your giant's beds of basalt. Each is a rerun of the same human pilot episode. See something huge, anchor it in story, give it a job. The square cube lore clears its throat again in your memory from the cave. Even if a saga accidentally described a truly enormous human, the engineering would keep that population rare and fragile. Actual historical tallness, your future Robert Wadlow, your present-day basketball centers, shows up as individuals in communities, not as an entire rival species building volcano forges. The physics doesn't cancel the poetry. It makes the metaphor shine without pretending it's a measurement. Joke 3. The only thing a 10-foot human reliably forges is a relationship with their orthopedic surgeon. So you let the jötnar stay large enough to carry night on their shoulders. You let the Greek giants keep their snake legs and their talent for losing to city planning. You let Finn McCool keep his columned road because the wind on that cliff is better with a story in it. Meanwhile, when you lace your boots to walk a dolmen field or trace a basalt wall, you carry a quieter wonder. Normal-sized hands moved more stone than your lower back wants to think about. Ropes rollers. Winter ground 100 patient people, those are the true giants whose footprints travel in teams. Night thickens. You taste salt from an invisible sea and resin from black pine. The myths do what bedtime myths should. They sing you out of yourself and then set you down gently right where you started. Torch in hand, able to tell the land and the old fear apart. Tomorrow you'll need your tape measure again. Skeptics have errands, but tonight you let the chorus finish its final chord. Giants here are memories, scaffolding metaphors you can climb to see farther. When you climb down, you tuck the Cyclops skull illusion back beside Gigantopithecus's molar. Pat the basalt bed and leave the serpent-legged brawlers in the painted frieze where they belong, forever losing to dawn. You cross the equator and ride the long tail of a continent until wind keeps a permanent appointment with your jacket. The sky over Patagonia feels oversize, like someone ordered 2 skies and forgot to return one. Here the word giant boards a 16th century ship and never quite gets off. Sailors of Magellan's fleet step ashore, meet towering hunter-gatherers on the beach, and send Europe a postcard that reads, "We've found a land of giants." You stand in that sand and squint along the surf, and the mirage clears a little. The people are tehuelche aonikenk, tall for their time. Many men reportedly brushing 6 feet or more in an era when average European heights run shorter. They favor hefty guanaco hide boots that add a few centimeters and leave prints like frying pans. The Spaniards, primed by chivalric romances, name the place Patagonia after Patagon, a monster from a then popular novel. Quirky tidbit for your pocket, the very word Patagonia may owe its birth to a book character's nickname, not a tape measure. Joke 1, if travel influencers had existed, hashtag Bigfoot Beach would have trended for months. You kneel where a camp once stood and imagine the arithmetic that went wrong. A tall person in thick boots on a low horizon looks taller. Unfamiliar posture and layered furs widen silhouettes. A translator rounds up because very tall sells better than above average. Historians still argue whether Magellan's crew truly met individuals over 7 feet, or whether expectation clothing and storytelling stretched real stature into legend. What the ground gives you points of stone bones of guanaco hearths crouched out of the wind belongs to ordinary human bodies doing extraordinary travel in a punishing landscape. The square cube lore from your cave clears its throat again. Whole tribes of healthy 9-footers would leave a biomechanical paper trail of custom tools and reinforced shelters. The archaeological layer here hums with skill, not impossibility. The giants of Patagonia go on tour anyway. Later expeditions arrive, tuned to the same key. Some journals count heights generously, others mutter corrections into the margins. You look up from the page and watch the gossip drift north like foam lines. By the time it reaches European docks, the beach story has grown shoulders. The reality still tall and impressive steps aside, while the adjective keeps walking. Now you climb a bluff along a broad green river in the north of the other America and look down on earthworks that run like music across the valley. Mounds, conical platform effigy make the land itself a library. 19th century curiosity meets these shapes and writes a seductive hypothesis. A lost race of giants must have built them because the present native nations, so the story goes, couldn't. That was less about evidence and more about a politics that wanted cleared land and tidy origin myths. The mainstream peg you carry tonight is firm. The mounds were built by indigenous cultures, the Adena Hopewell Mississippian among them over many centuries. Radiocarbon dates pottery styles, soil layers, and living descendant communities weave a single stubborn conclusion. These are local genius with long memory, not a vanished army of titans. You walk the graceful coil of Ohio's Serpent Mound at dusk and let the tale disappear into shadow. The exact builders and dates of particular sites still invite careful work. Historians and archaeologists still argue whether the serpent's primary construction belongs to the Adena culture, with later modifications, or to the Fort Ancient period, but the range of possibilities never needs a separate species. What grew instead were newspapers. Small-town columns in the 1800s printed breathless notices of giant skeletons found in ploughed mounds 10-12 feet, and the bones always seemed to vanish the moment someone asked for a scale bar or a sober anatomist. Joke too, those giants had worse timing than your phone battery at 2%. You crouch at a museum drawer and slide out projectile points, copper plates, shell beads, objects that fit your hands perfectly. The houses these people raised were scaled to families like yours. The post holes circle like modest constellations. The palisades are stout, not superhuman, where burials include unusually tall individuals. Yes, they occur in any large population. Their bones sit in a normal orchestra of statures, not a brass section of colossi. When early antiquarians mismeasured femora or mixed human bones with those of elk or bear, they sometimes built a giant by arithmetic alone. Your callback from the Cyclops field returns one creature, one set. Context is king. Drift west along the Missouri and read Captain John Smith's famous map of Virginia. He draws a Susquehannock warrior towering club, raised a walking threat display. Was Smith reporting a literal 7-footer or sketching ethnographic poster art? These northerners are formidable for readers across an ocean. Historians still argue whether his captioned giants signals unusual height or symbolic bigness in battle and reputation. You thumb the map's paper and feel both possibilities wrinkle together. The mainstream ground truth you meet in graves and houses around the Chesapeake, a familiar spread of human statures. Hard work, pressed into bone, no reliable layer of titanic neighbors. Across North America, indigenous traditions teem with large beings, sometimes human, sometimes not. The Haudenosaunee speak of stone giants. On the plains, stories tell of powerful figures at the margins of camps. In the Pacific Northwest, you hear of wild people of the woods. Farther north, you shiver at the name of winter cannibals whispered at the edge of the firelight. Treat them with respect. These are moral geographies, not field guides. They patrol boundaries, teach caution, and explain how to live where storms are personalities. When colonists and later collectors cherry-picked these narratives and stapled them to giant bones stories, they often flattened teachings into sensational headlines. Your job tonight is to keep the layers stacked correctly like good archaeology does. You return briefly to the plains of the South. Spanish accounts out of Florida and the Southeast sometimes mention giant peoples. French and English travelers pick up the tune. The Calusa rule coasts with warrior nobles and canals. Mississippian chiefdoms stack platforms into skylines. Power makes people loom even when their shadows stay human-sized. Remove the exoticizing lens, and the pattern remains political tallness, not skeletal impossibility. Joke 3: if Swagger added inches half of colonial diaries would need taller door frames. A quirky South American footnote wanders back from the beach and taps your notebook. Those guanaco hide boots botas de potro weren't fashion. They were technology. Thick soles for thorns, windproof wraps for long rides, a design that generously upsizes footprints for distant onlookers. Couple that with the headgear cloaks and the way a tall rider sits against the horizon, and you build a postcard that says "Giant" before anyone sets up a yardstick. Pair the postcard with a Europe primed by romances and marvels, and you get a brand that sticks to maps for 500 years. You tilt your head toward the prairie wind and listen for the mounds again. Adana conical forms lift like quiet breaths. Hopewell enclosures draw geometries wider than town blocks. Mississippian plazas hold games, markets, and sun rituals. This is civil engineering tuned to community labor and calendar time. The true giant is organization. When epidemics and upheaval later shred populations, the building patterns fray and later arrivals stumble on weed-softened earthworks and reach for the easiest label. Giants did this. The builders are gone. It's a story with good manners for land claims and bad manners for truth. Before you leave, you thumb one last scrapbook of 19th century clippings that insist up and down that 12-foot skeletons were boxed and shipped to museums where they tragically went missing. You will follow those paper trails in a later walk and find the hoaxes, misquotes, and conspiracies stacked like poorly labeled crates. For tonight, you pin a mainstream fact in your hatband, where excavations were careful and the reporting competent skeletons from mounds fit human ranges. When writers forgot scales, mixed remains, or wrote satire mistaken for fact, measurements grew overnight like zucchini. The river flattens into a mirror and carries the moon like a plate. You can almost hear a Tehuelche rider laugh in the wind as they pass, boots, heavy posture, easy, exactly as tall as they need to be to cross a day the size of Patagonia. You can almost hear a Mississippian drummer call the plaza to order with a rhythm that travels up a platform into the night. Across 2 continents, the same lesson meets you at different latitudes. Big stories strap themselves to big landscapes and big works. If you keep your tape handy and your respect closer still, the legends stay luminous while the bones keep their honest size. You angle the map toward heat that smells of cardamom and dust, then pivot to winds that taste like salt from 2 oceans. Giants step out here wearing many names, not tape measures. Rakshasa, who roar from Sanskrit, verse mountain walkers from Chinese cosmogonies, tree-dwelling watchers of island nights, and ogres from African storytelling, whose footfalls are really thunderheads rolling in. You keep your torch low and your definitions looser, because in these landscapes, size signals virtue or danger more often than it reports centimeters. Your feet land first in an Indian forest that hums with cicadas and politics. You hear the Ramayana and the Mahabharata breathe like long bellows epics compiled and reshaped across centuries. Within them, bodies swell or shrink with meaning. Bhima, son of the wind, isn't called a giant as a species. He's a power setting the friend you ask to move the boulder and the moral load. His club smashes arrogance as much as armor. Gatotkacha, his son, is painted larger than life in battle, because his death will be a hinge on which destinies turn. Size is sacrifice measured in silhouettes. Then there's Kumbhakarna, Ravana's brother, vast as a siege tower, and sleep-prone from a legendarily bungled boon. One version says he went in asking for Indra's seat and walked out with sleep due to a divine tongue-twister. Quirky tidbit-stored Sanskrit puns can rearrange your calendar. Joke one that's the most relatable mythic power, accidentally asking the universe for a nap. You step from verse onto later folk tales where Rakshasas, Rakosh in Bengali loom as man-eaters with eyes like coals and appetites for rule-breaking. They are not a census of tall neighbors. They are the nightmare category for don't stray from the village, don't break the guest laws, don't boast. Historians still argue whether the epics preserve memory echoes of real clashes between forest and city polities, wild and settled, or whether the scale simply dramatizes ethics drama stretched in letters tall enough to read by moonlight. Either way, the ground agrees that the tools and houses in ancient India scale to ordinary bodies. Your yardstick stays calm, your metaphors do the heavy lifting. Across the Bay of Bengal and through island chains, ogres go by new passports. In Java you meet Buto Iho, a green-skinned giant whose statue sometimes serves as a talisman. Here bulk is the shape of fear and of protection, depending on which way you face it on your porch. In the Philippines, a kapre climbs a balete tree and smokes not to chase joggers, but to sit at the edge of the trail like a living caution light. He is tall because thresholds need tall guardians. The forest around you smells of sap and rain, and you realize that giant here is really a pedagogy scale borrowed to teach respect for roots and roots at night. Now the air cools and grows crystalline. You read a Chinese line that begins before there were lines, Pangu. The first being cleaves sky from earth and grows each day to keep them apart. When he dies, his breath becomes wind, his voice thunder his body, the mountains, cosmic anatomy lesson with a giant as protractor. Later in the classic of mountains and seas, Kwafu chases the sun and drinks rivers dry. When thirst kills him, his staff becomes a forest. That's your mainstream peg. Chinese myth cycles use colossal bodies to explain why the world is shaped the way it is, mountains as ribs, rivers as veins, a choice that rhymes with the Norse Ymir you met earlier without being its twin. Joke 2, the only fitness tracker that could handle Pangu's steps is also a seismograph. You wander temple courtyards where immortal footprints pucker in stone tourist markers that once told villagers a sage stood here, and you hear your Cyclops lesson purr in your pocket. Odd geologies want bodies to wear. Basalt pans fill with rain and declare themselves sandal prints. Weathered boulders become shoulders. The land requests a mythic tailor. Historians still argue whether some of these imprints began as dinosaur tracks or erosion hollows repurposed by local cults. But everyone agrees the result is a story calibrated to the sightline of a pilgrim. Big step, big lesson. South again to an African savanna where late light tints grass with bronze. In Zulu storytelling, Isikuku Madavu looms the giantess who swallows heroes and must be outwitted, not outfought. Her stomach isn't a zoology lecture. It's a metaphorical house of consequences. Break taboos, get eaten by the problem you made. In West African markets, trickster tales stretch villains to fit the size of their greed. When storms pummel tin roofs, a grandmother will say a giant turned over in sleep. Size here is a weather language and a social court. Then the archaeology winks at you from the ground. At Great Zimbabwe, stone walls arc like waves. At Ethiopia's Tia carved stele stand. In the Sahara at Nabta Playa, megaliths align with seasons. The old colonial habit once handed these to foreign builders or giants, anything but the local hands that cut, hauled, and planned. Your mainstream anchor tonight is simple and solid. These works are by ancestors of communities still present. Shona for Great Zimbabwe, local pastoralists. For Nabta Playa, human-scale engineering multiplied by time and teamwork. The true giants are choreographies, not shin bones. You press your palm to a dolmen in the Atlas foothills and feel evening cool through stone. Guides once called such tables beds of giants, a label twin to Bashan's iron bed and Ireland's giant's table. You smile at the familiar pattern. When you lack cranes, you supply colossi. When you add oxen rollers and patient winters, the stones move without mythical knees. Your yardstick doesn't roll its eyes. It measures the post holes around the site and finds footprints that look exactly like 100 lunches divided among cousins. On the Nile's old banks, you lean toward histories written with chisel and reed. Pharaohs proclaim long stride and cosmic reach. Statues outgrow temples as visual policy. Ramesses II looms not because he ducked door frames, but because rule needs theater. You remember how Smith drew his giant Susquehannocks for an Atlantic audience? You recognize the same advertisement here, only in granite. Historians still argue whether particular reliefs exaggerate bodies for ritual perspective or for intimidation. You quietly note that the beds, sandals, and chariots in tombs fit human ankles just fine. Across the Sahel, you hear the griot's kora and the name Sundiata ride a melody. In the epic, the future founder of Mali rises from childhood weakness to unstoppable strength. At one point, he uproots a baobab. Is that a forestry report? Not at all. It's a moral landscaping patience, maternal loyalty, and rightful rule pulled up by the root. Your earlier honey-raiding wink returns real calories made real children taller when larders were full, but literary calories make leaders big enough to be seen from the future. A sea breeze finds you again as you stand under a baobab the size of a quiet miracle. You think of the Capre's silent cigarette and the Bhutto statue's green scowl. You think of Rakshasas who break rules and Bhima who breaks boulders. You think of Khuafu whose thirst is a climate parable wrapped in calves of thunder. Each uses height as a keyboard to play duty, trespass, and awe. Meanwhile, the square cube law, the grumpy bouncer from Section 1, keeps standing at the biological door, arms folded. Actual skeletal populations remain normal-sized in the digs. The megaliths, when read with patient logistics, land safely in human hands. Joke 3 Physics still refuses to comp your cover charge just because your myth has a VIP list. You finish the loop with an ordinary footprint in dust beside yours. It belongs to a mason at a stellar field, a porter on a causeway, a storyteller under a neem tree. The epics, the folk tales, the cosmogonies, they made bodies big to keep ideas from blowing away. You carry that trick back to your own small house when you want a child to respect the forest, make the forest tall enough to look back. When you want a city to remember its founders, cast them in a height that will not fit under a hat. And when the land offers you a stone bowl full of rain, remember your Cyclops skull and your basalt bed measure. Kindly label clearly and still let the reflection make you feel small the way good stories do. You follow a county road that smells like cut hay and carnival popcorn and pull up beside a tent with a hand-painted sign. Come see the petrified giant. You already feel your tape measure squint. Hoaxes thrive. Where wonder is hungry and verification is slow, perfect conditions in the 1800s when newspapers sprinted faster than scholars and a carved lie could tour like a rock band. You duck inside and meet the most famous napper in American dirt, a 10-foot stone man lying stiff as a sermon. That's your mainstream peg, Cardiff, New York, 1869. A gypsum colossus, carefully carved, stained with tobacco juice for age, buried on a farm, then discovered by well diggers to the gasps of paying crowds. Scientists sniffed the chisel marks. The show went on anyway. P.T. Barnum even made his own copy when he couldn't rent the original, proving that in the 19th century you could counterfeit a counterfeit and still get a line out the door. Joke 1, if there had been an app back then it would have been called Insta-Giant. The lesson rides shotgun for the rest of tonight. Crowds don't guarantee truth. Tickets don't fossilize anything but expectations. You wander past the giant's toes and remember the earlier Cyclops skull trick. Misreading anatomy birthed some legends. Here artistry does the heavy lifting. The seams in the story are clear when you kneel, no stratigraphic context, no associated artifacts. Soil still sulking about being dug last month. Real skeletons arrive with neighbors' tools, pollen, charcoal, animal bones, like a village in the ground. Hoaxes travel alone wearing cologne. The tent empties and you walk to a courthouse where a glass case holds an enormous axe, the placard sighing giant. Your hands know better. Oversized tools often turn out to be ceremonial stone blades, plough parts, pestles, or simply boulders weathered into tempting shapes. In some river valleys, glacial cobbles fracture into neat wedges. An eager eye promotes them to Titan gear. A quirky tidbit to slip in your pocket, a few showmen once planted comically large stone hammers beside fake giant burials to complete the look. As if a 10-footer would carry an anvil on a stick to swat deer. Joke 2, the only thing those hammers could nail is the vibe. Your next stop is the 19th century newspaper morgue, a room that rustles like a flock of moths. Headlines shout, "Giant skeleton unearthed 10 feet if an inch." Dig into the column, and you meet the usual suspects. A farmer a mound, an excited physician with a yardstick that seems to stretch in print. Then the bones go missing on the way to the museum, or arrive and quietly shrink under sober measuring. Historians still argue whether some of these articles began as local satire that readers elsewhere took straight, or whether editors simply juiced mundane finds into marvels to sell papers. Either way, the pattern is paint by numbers, no provenience, no photograph with scale, no follow-up lab notes, only adjectives. If you hear a familiar snore, it's the square cube law napping with one eye open. You kneel in a real trench to see how honest errors happen, because not every giant was carved in a barn. Skeletons decay and shift. Coffins collapse, vertebrae flatten, long bones slide into gaps. If you measure from the back of the skull to the tip of curled toes in situ, you can add phantom inches the way enthusiastic bakers add raisins. Soil expands and contracts with wet and dry seasons. Bones swell with mineral salts. Shovels shave off ends. A careful osteologist reassembles on a table and measures long bones directly femur. Tibia humerus then estimates stature with tested formulas. A hurried antiquarian measures the whole and writes poetry. You leaf further back and land in 1613 on the Rhone, where diggers at a quarry pulled huge bones from clay. Scholars declared the remains to be Teutobochus, king of the Cimbri. Proof of antique giants towering over Gaul. Later naturalists recognized the truth. Proboscidean pieces likely are mastodons. Your Cyclops lesson nods when fossils seep into human storytelling. Before comparative anatomy exists, heroes and monsters collect bones like children collect stickers. The past isn't lying. It's labeling with the markers it has. You detour into sideshow country where pickled Fijian mermaids share shelf space with the alleged captua. A two-headed giant taxidermy carpentry, and chutzpah stitched into a single admission fee. You touch the glass and feel the hum of a market that monetizes awe. Historians still argue whether certain proprietors half believed their own pitches or whether everyone winked and called it theater. Your rule stays simple: if it can't survive a lab, it shouldn't survive a legend without an asterisk. Back to the respectable museum, because errors live here too. Early curators sometimes mixed bones from multiple individuals or even species, then reconstructed what looked right. A human tibia, an elk femur, a bear scapula. Voila a long dramatic frame that never walked the earth, except in the imagination of a display designer. Cataloging, then, was a heroic paper exercise. Barcodes and databases now keep elbows with elbows. Joke 3 somewhere a mislabeled drawer still holds. Left femur possible, giant, also 17 keys and a sandwich from 1894. You step through a small gallery of footprints in stone, giant sandaled impressions pocked with rain. Many are erosional pans potholes in limestone or dinosaur tracks worn into humanish shapes by centuries of boots. A few were carved as pilgrim attractions. Even priests have roofs to repair. The mainstream guardrail you keep tight tonight, trackways that are real, come with multiple prints in sequence. Consistent stride and age in the right rock. A single lonely foot on a boulder that can be lifted into a wagon is a selfie spot, not Paleolithic podiatry. At the back table, a volunteer unfolds a brittle broadside accusing institutions. Pick your favorite national museum of hiding giant bones to protect evolution faith or property values depending on who's telling the tale. You won't chase conspiracies yet. That map waits in the next section. For now, you note the choreography hoax or error births a headline. A debunk follows in a smaller, sober font. Decades later, the clipping missing the debunk circulates as suppressed truth. Screenshots become fossils in a new geology, the internet's tar pits preserving everything except context. You stretch-sip a thermos that tastes like optimism and cardboard and return to the good faith mistakes because that's where kindness lives. A farmer with a plow is not the villain of your story. A small-town editor with slow mail is not Satan in a green visor. People saw large things and tried to fit them into their world with the conceptual tools they had. You, with better anatomy charts and faster peer review, can correct without sneering. The Cardiff Giant is clownish, yes, but it also teaches skepticism without killing wonder. Ask for the layer, the neighbors, the lab, the repeatable measurement. If the exhibit only offers a ticket and a grin, enjoy the popcorn and keep your wallet in your front pocket. Before you leave, you pin 3 reminders to your coat. First, hoax is love. Single objects, a lone giant, a single titanic axe, a footprint without a friend. Real prehistory behaves like a neighborhood. Second, errors, love-haste in situ estimations. Newspaper inches filled before the bones are dry. Third, tall tales, love motives, pride in a town. Profit for a tent, politics for a land claim. Historians still argue whether some antiquarians were dupes or partners, but the bones never argue. They just lie there waiting for the right questions. Night settles along the fence line, and crickets start an opinion piece. You think of the tobacco-stained gypsum, the oversized tools, the 2 long graves, and you feel oddly comforted. You don't need a world littered with 10-foot cousins to feel awe. You need a good shovel, a slow notebook, and a sense of humor that survives chisel marks. Tomorrow, since you asked nicely, you'll follow the rumor that museums hid the big skeletons in basement vaults and never called back. Bring your flashlight and your patience. The doors in those stories usually open to empty rooms, and the echo you hear is just the square cube law laughing in the dark. You descend a concrete stair where the air smells like dust, cotton gloves, and promises. If internet rumors were maps, this is where X marks the hidden vaults, rows of giant femora under tarps, a librarian with a torch whispering, "We were told to hide them." You flick your light and meet. Metal shelves, acid-free boxes, and accession ledgers that look like they balance the national budget. Welcome to the conspiracy tour. Bring your curiosity. Leave the trench coat. Start with the loudest whisper. The Smithsonian destroyed giant skeletons. The story usually arrives as a collage Victorian newspaper clippings about enormous bones, a vague Supreme Court ruling that somehow no law library can pull, and a claim that curators smashed or sank the evidence to protect somebody's worldview. Your earlier rules clear their throat bones, beat anecdotes, context rules. All math doesn't care about clicks. Here's your mainstream peg. The Smithsonian did collect thousands of human remains during the 19th and early 20th centuries, some from mounds. Many from ordinary cemeteries by modern standards, and catalogued them with measurements that almost never break the biological scoreboard. Later, under repatriation laws and partnerships, large numbers were returned to descendant communities. Hidden often turns out to mean reburied with ceremony or still awaiting NAGPRA consultation, not swept into a volcano at midnight. Joke 1, if the institution wanted 0 paperwork, it picked the wrong century. You open a ledger and read the tidy violence of numbers, femur lengths, cranial capacities, provenience, notes like Mound Group X Trench B. The occasional large individual surfaces tall people exist, but the arithmetic lands inside human possibility without calling the square cube bouncer. When 19th century newspapers trumpeted 10-foot skeletons, they were often measuring the grave cut, eyeballing curled toes, or juicing a column for readers 3 counties away. Historians still argue whether some editors wrote satire that other papers reprinted as fact, or whether honest field mistakes were laundered into marvels by distance and delay. Either way, when you chase those clippings into museum accessions, the trail usually narrows to ordinary bones with extraordinary headlines. A quirky basement truth taps your shoulder. Sometimes collections really did vanish, but to fire and flood, not to secret agendas. The Smithsonian castle burned in 1865, and early anthropology suffered losses. Rail shipments broke, labels fell off, curators retired with 19th century filing systems that were bravely optimistic about twine. If you want mystery, you can have plenty without inventing a Smash the Giants committee. You leave the ledgers and angle west to a Nevada cave where the air dries your lips between words. Lovelock. Guano miners worked here in the early 1900s, shoveling bat dung by the ton, and in the process disturbed a layer cake of ancient deposits. Later professional excavations pulled wonders from the dust net fragments, sandals baskets, and those famous duck decoys, delicate and lifelike, some of the oldest known in the Americas. Alongside the artifacts, human remains appeared, some in bundles, some scattered by earlier digging. That's the mainstream, a real archaeological site, with real, well-documented finds that fit living cultural histories of the Great Basin. So where do red-haired giants enter the room? In the weave of oral tradition and outsider retelling. Northern Paiute stories tell of the Site-Ka, hostile others who lived in the region. Later narrators morphed them into towering cannibals with hair like flame and stapled them to the cave. But human hair buried in alkali soils often shifts toward red as pigments break down. Sun-bleached bundles look ginger by chemistry, not genealogy. Measurements taken from remains museum-side land comfortably within normal human ranges, with the occasional tall individual that any large population can produce. Historians still argue whether the Site-Ka reflect memories of distinct historic enemies, mythic beings used to teach boundary law, or a braid of both. No argument grounded in the actual measurements requires a separate species of 8-foot neighbors. Joke 2. The only thing guaranteed to get taller in Lovelock is the story you tell on the drive home. You crouch by a case labeled photographic evidence, a glossy print of men in hard hats posing with a giant skull the size of a coffee table. Your tape stays holstered because your memory already has the label a digital art contest image from the early 2000s that escaped into chain emails and refuses to return to its habitat. Next to it, a mummified giant finger that turns out to be a movie prop, a 2-headed cap-doigt whose stitches are better than its citations. The internet is a tar pit where hoaxes fossilize faster than retractions. Screenshots are the new mastodon molars, heavy enough to tip a story for anyone who prefers pictures to paperwork. Back downstairs, the conspiracy crafts a motive. Museums hide giants to protect evolution or religion or real estate, pick one. But institutions are quarrelsome in public. The easiest grant in the world would be, we found a new hominin in a basement. Scientists adore career-making anomalies, provided the chain of custody and measurements survive peer review. Quiet, boring reality is the actual drag accession. Numbers must match bones. Provenience must be more precise than a mound near town. Long bone lengths must translate to stature formulas that other labs can repeat. Hidden remains tend to be exactly where a registrar says they are, or already returned to communities with a paper trail that looks like a phone book. You flip to the page conspiracies, always bookmark. But what about that Supreme Court case? You search, you ask law librarians, you run your fingers along false citations like rosary beads, and the docket never lands. A claim without a case number is a bedtime story, not jurisprudence. The same goes for footnotes that chase themselves in circles. Article A, cites forum B, which cites Article A. Your earlier Cardiff lesson nods sympathetically. A carved lie can be very durable if it's fun to tell. Kindness keeps you steady. Many people who share these tales are chasing wonder, not malice. They want a world where a buried headline can overturn a textbook. They want a secret door in the museum that opens into awe. Your job isn't to lock the door. It's to show the real entrance, slow excavation, measurable bones communities, whose ancestors deserve names instead of clickbait. When a rumor says a 12-foot skeleton was shipped to Washington and never seen again, you can ask which crate, which train, which accession number, and what the long bones read at the table. If the answer's thin to adjectives, you've likely reached the edge of the map. Still, you leave space for the only honest suspense science owns. Somewhere someday a burial may yield an individual so tall and well-preserved that it makes headlines without quotation marks. It will come with provenience, with osteology, with DNA, where preservation allows, with descendant consultation, where law and respect require. It won't need a dim hallway and a secret handshake. Historians still argue whether our appetite for giants is nostalgia for bigness in an age of small screens, or a psychological mirror of power, or both. Either way, good evidence sleeps light and wakes early. You climb back toward daylight and pass a rolling cart stacked with boxes, field notes on top. Artifacts below a bag of shell beads rustling like rain. The real secret the basement kept from you is not suppression, but abundance rooms so full of ordinary, well-provenanced history that a single sensational claim can't find a chair. The square cube bouncer at the doorway gives you a nod on the way out, as if to say, "We didn't have to throw anyone out tonight." Joke 3, you tip him anyway exact change in accession numbers. Outside, the sun makes the museum's stone glow like a calm oven. You remember the Cyclops skull's misleading eye, the Megafauna parading by in shaggy coats, the giant ape with a molar heavy as a secret, the Cardiff prankster with his tobacco-stained gypsum, the miners in Lovelock with guano in their eyelashes, and a future rumor at their feet. Breadcrumbs of citations, misquotes, and missing context led you here. Ledger's laws and long bones walked you back out. You tuck the tape away. If giants exist tonight, they're the stacks of careful pages and the patience to read them without blinking. You step into a quiet lab that smells like paper and chalk and set your torch down beside a ruler that looks a little nervous. Tonight you test the ceiling, the place where physics taps your giant dreams on the shoulder and says, "Nice story. Let's do math." Your old friend from Section 1, the square cube law, waits by the whiteboard like a bouncer with a calculator. Double her body's height, and its weight tries to go up 8-fold, while the cross-sectional areas that carry that weight only go up 4-fold. Stress per square centimeter climbs. Bones and tendons must thicken. The thickening adds mass. The mass demands more thickening. It's a feedback loop with the comic timing of a door that locks itself. Start with bone, because bones keep minutes. Your femur doesn't just resist pushing, it resists bending. The strength you care about scales with the second moment of area. Think how far the bone's material sits from its center, which is why limb bones swell in diameter in big animals. Keep human proportions while pushing toward 3 meters, and your femur snipes you with math. To keep stresses in the same safe neighborhood, you'd need a leg more like a column, less like a runner's strut. Elephants show you the template, straight. Thick shafts, wide feet, short, distal segments. Fine, you say, just give your 12-footer elephant legs. But then gait slows, agility drops, and stairs become policy decisions. Joke 1, your new PR in the 100-meter dash is eventually. Muscle pulls the same trick. Maximum muscle force scales with cross-sectional area, not volume. Upsize the whole body and you get less strength per kilogram. A scaled-up human with cartoon proportions lifts less relative to their weight, jumps lower, and spends more time negotiating with gravity about refunds. To keep performance, you'd need disproportionate bulking of thighs, calves, and glutes, more mass, more heat, more metabolic bills. Tendons complain first. Their safety margins shrink with size because peak stresses arrive during running and landing right where your bedtime ankles would like a union. Now step inside cardio time. A tall body must push blood uphill to a brain that's farther from the pump. Giraffes get away with this using hearts like power tools, absurdly high, arterial pressures, tight skin on their legs to fight edema and clever valves. Your human blueprint didn't budget for that. In very tall modern people, even far below giraffe problems, orthostatic dizziness, varicose veins, and foot issues show up like uninvited cousins. Push height toward the mythical and systolic pressure, must climb capillaries, sprain, and kidneys get memos they do not appreciate. Historians still argue whether a population of truly giant bipeds could evolve bespoke cardiovascular workarounds without turning into something that no longer reads as human. Longer trunks with lower heads, thicker arteries, perhaps even countercurrent tricks in the legs. The more plausible it gets, the less human it looks. Breathe with it. Lungs scale well in surface area, but your problem isn't only oxygen capture, it's heat dump. Surface area grows slower than volume, so the bigger you are, the harder it is to shed metabolic heat. Humans are heat-dumping champions. We sweat like professionals, but a 3-meter frame running a hunter's itinerary would overheat on a spring afternoon, unless you grant it new radiators, huge ears, hello elephant cosplay, sparse insulation, slower gaits, more shade. Upright posture stacks organs vertically. Warmed blood returning from legs has farther to travel through a hot core before you can vent that heat. In cold climates, a giant warms nicely. In hot ones, it becomes a slow cooker. You glance at the oxygen myth that always knocks politely, but didn't. Prehistoric oxygen-set creatures get huge. Yes, arthropods in the Carboniferous grew gloriously weird. Dragonflies like dinner plates when atmospheric oxygen ran high. That matters for insects because they breathe through passive tracheal tubes. More O2 in the air pushes deeper. Vertebrates like you carry oxygen on hemoglobin. You're not limited by the same pipe geometry. More oxygen would goose endurance. It wouldn't fix collapsing knees or bulldoze the square cube law. Quirky tidbit to slip into your pocket in the early 20th century, some showmen put fleas in tiny circus harnesses. They could lift amazing mini-loads only because at that small scale, muscles are overpowered relative to weight. Upsize the flea and you don't get a circus strongman, you get a medical emergency. Joke too somewhere a flea is bragging about its deadlift on tiny social media. History gives you 2 scaling tutors who whisper like librarians. Galileo in 2 New Sciences, 1638, pointed out that big buildings and animals need thicker members. You can't just enlarge a model and expect it to stand. And J.B.S. Haldane, in his 1926 essay on being the right size, made the quiet point loud with delightful examples why a mouse can fall down a shaft and saunter away while a horse cannot. Why an insect's legs seem like steel and an elephant's like pudding if you mistake scale for weakness. That's your mainstream anchor. Modern biomechanics sits on old, sturdy shoulders. The idea that size changes rules is not a new party trick. Walk the rest of the body. Joints must broaden to spread forces. Cartilage must thicken, but cartilage heals slowly and hates being starved of oxygen. Spines must manage longer lever arms from head and trunk. Lumbar discs see higher moments. Posture leans toward the column again. Feet must widen to keep pressure per square centimeter sane. Arches flatten under load unless tendons go from violin strings to toe cables. Speed collapses, Fall risk rises, fractures get dramatic. The allometry that lets ostriches sprint on long distal limbs betrays you because their tendons act like springs and their mass sits low. A human scaled by enthusiasm ends up top-heavy with shins begging for redesign. You flick the lab lights and bring in a comparative parade. The tallest living bipeds by mass were non-avian dinosaurs, but their hip structures, tail counterbalances, and limb proportions were nothing like yours. The heaviest living land animals, elephants, keep 4 columns on the ground most of the time. When they run, they're really doing a fast walk without aerial phase. A true human giant trying to sprint would discover why sports medicine clinics exist. Historians still argue whether there's a theoretical upper bound for human height, in the absence of pathology somewhere around 2.6–2.8 meters with massive skeletal reinforcement versus the more practical bound set by childhood growth nutrition and the accumulation of orthopedic risks. Either way, 9 to 12 feet for whole populations isn't a ceiling, it's a glass floor that shatters when you step on it. Metabolism quietly adds a footnote. Basal energy needs scale roughly to body mass 0.75, which means big bodies are efficient furnaces, but moving them costs more absolutely. A giant hunter needs giant lunches. Caloric density and supply variability start to dictate culture. If you must eat double, but can't chase double, your calendar fills with sitting and strategic ambush instead of long pursuit. A society of such bodies would design landscapes, wide doors, thick ladders, reinforced platforms that archaeology can spot. What we actually find are doorways, boats, and beds scaled to ordinary humans across tens of thousands of sites. The material culture snitches. You pause at the planet hack people love to throw in. What about lower gravity? Sure, on Mars, with about 38% of Earth's gravity, a taller, lightly built hominin might work better. The square cube law still applies, but the load factor relaxes. It's a fun thought experiment, not a passport stamp in your Pleistocene. Bring that back to Earth and your ankles send a fruit basket for remembering them at last. Joke 3, your orthopedic surgeon just liked that comment without reading the rest. Not everything in this lab is a red stamp. The same constraints explain your world's beauty. Children grow taller when diets stabilize, because you're playing inside the rules, not breaking them. Endurance runners succeed because your cooling system is a cheat code at your scale. The tallest recorded modern individuals whom you'll meet next section walk right up to the edge of what heart's joints and heat can manage, and their biographies read like engineering reports with feelings. That edge is real. It's why you don't find spear points that demand hands the size of dinner platters or sandals that span a yardstick except as jokes or temple metaphors. So you sit back on the lab stool and breathe the sleepy satisfaction of limits well drawn. Biology isn't trying to ruin your giant bedtime story. It's setting the fable in a world where ankles matter and hearts keep time. Galileo's beams, Haldane's mice, your own sweaty skin. They all hum the same tune size, writes rules on tendons and trachea, and those rules are kinder than you think. They protect small things from shattering and keep big things from melting. When a tale hands you a nation of towering hunters, you can still enjoy the thunder of their steps, then wake gently and lay a ruler across the page. The dream doesn't die. It just stands on legs that don't. You step out of the lab of limits and into a quiet gallery where the floor hums with shoe leather and memory. This is where Giant stops being a campfire silhouette and becomes a person with a pulse, a favorite chair, and a doctor who worries. You walk up beside the tallest reliably measured human in the record books, Robert Pershing Wadlow, and try not to measure him with myths you've already retired. He stands in photographs at 8 feet 11 inches, 2.72 meters a height, reached not by a tribe's secret gene, but by a pituitary gland that wouldn't throttle back. Excess growth hormone during childhood drives bones to lengthen soft tissues, to bulk joints to grumble. and the heart to keep filing overtime gigantism when it starts early acromegaly when it continues later. That's your mainstream anchor. Modern real giants are medical, not mythical. You pull a postcard from Alton, Illinois, and it smells faintly of county fairs. Wadlow tours in the 1930s with a sponsor shakes hands that disappear in his signs, autographs, with a gentleness that makes the pen look small. His smile is steady, but the frame underneath is a negotiation braces to steady. Fragile joints numbness where nerves tire of long routes, infections waiting at any blister. He dies at 22 from a septic infection after an ankle brace rubs a sore he couldn't feel. The square cube law, the bouncer who's been shadowing you since Section 1 never stopped following him. It just put on a sport coat and stood behind the curtain. Joke 1 physics doesn't buy a ticket to the show, but somehow it's always on the guest list. You crouch to consider the details that make him a person instead of an emblem. He was a Freemason and needed a custom-sized ring for the ceremony. He played with his younger siblings, he carried a camera on trips and took pictures of ordinary things, because ordinary things make the best souvenirs. Quirky tidbit, to pocket his shoe South S37AA meant each pair felt like a small canoe custom-built and carefully rationed. There is a sweetness in the logistics. Car seats, reinforced desks, raised doorways, negotiated with patience that returns you to a basic truth. When scale changes, everything mundane becomes engineering. Across the room, another tall shadow gathers attention. Even in silence, Charles Byrne, the Irish giant. London, 1783. He arrives as spectacle, a towering young man from County Londonderry with an entourage and a city that pays to stare. His condition is likely the same hormonal misfire, but the scaffolding around him is 18th century anatomy theatres, surgeons with reputations to build, and a public that treats bodies as cabinets of curiosity. He drinks, he performs, he worries. Fearing dissection, he gives friends money and instruction to bury him at sea in a lead coffin. He dies at roughly 22 as well, and the plan fails. John Hunter, the surgeon whose name still hangs on a museum, obtains the body through bribery and places the skeleton in his collection. That's another mainstream peg. Byrne's remains were displayed for generations. More recently, curators have removed them from public view, and ethics committees have wrestled with what dignity looks like in a case 2 centuries late. You stand between the two men and feel the pull of spectacle like a tide. People paid to see them. Companies paid them to be seen. Newspapers wrote about them as if height itself were a headline. Historians still argue whether such exhibitions were primarily exploitation that shaved years and privacy, or complicated bargains that offered tall performers income travel and some control in a world with few accommodations. The truth, like most human truths, probably moves with the day, the manager, and the pain level. You tip your head toward the medicine cabinet. Today, many cases of gigantism are managed with a triad transsphenoidal surgery on the pituitary adenoma, when possible medication to tame growth hormone, and IGF-1 and targeted radiation when needed. Even then, tall lives bend around collateral problems. Sleep apnea, joint degeneration, back pain, cardiomegaly. Sultan Kozan, a more recent record-holding tall man, benefits from modern treatment that slowed his continued growth. Zheng Jinlian, the tallest reliably recorded woman. 1970s China died young, her story reminding you that extreme height is a fragile equilibrium. None of this reads as a lost race. All of it reads as physiology, pushed past comfort, then negotiated with care. You revisit Byrne because his afterlife says as much about us as his height did about him. For decades, school children and surgeons studied his bones. Then came the slow turn toward consent repatriation and restraint. Museums rethought what education justifies. Debates moved from faculty lounges to public letters. Should Byrne's wish for a sea burial be honored now? Should the remains be retained for rare disease research that might save future patients? Historians still argue whether 18th century norms excuse hunters' acquisition, whether present-day duty to the living outweighs past coercion, and whether keeping the skeleton unseen is respect or evasion. You don't resolve it on a Tuesday night, you just note how swiftly Giant becomes a mirror for ethics. A small display near the exit holds sideshow posters. The tallest couple, Giantess of Nova Scotia, the Kentucky Giant. You scan the fonts, the promises, the cotton candy adjectives, and you hear faint echoes of Cardiff's carved prank and Barnum's copycat giant from Section 10. But the difference here is bone deep. These are people not plaster. Anna Heining Bates and Martin van Buren. It's very tall, very married, briefly a brand pose, hand in hand, then go home to an ordinary house with reinforced furniture and dreams that look exactly like yours, just higher on the shelf. Joke 2 step stools were the real MVPs. You sit with a quiet medical truth you wish you could whisper back through time. Earlier diagnosis, better surgery, and attentive primary care extend lives at the edge of tallness. Robert Wadlow died from an infection that modern wound care might have contained. Byrne died in a system that saw him first as a specimen. It's not that science erases limits, it sands a few sharp corners off them. You glance down at your notes, heights, shoe sizes, brace diagrams, and realize you've been measuring tenderness as much as tibias. What do these biographies do to your big question? They don't multiply tribes, they complicate individuals. The tallest human heights on record sit inside a narrow medical corridor with costs that show up in braces, surgeries, and calendars filled with rest. Their homes don't require doorways 3 meters high for everyone. Their neighborhoods don't leave sandals the size of snowboards by the door. Material culture testifies against a secret population. The hospital chart testifies for fragile outliers. Still, your mind reaches for one last sideways candle. Quirky Tidbit, the traveling shoe company that sponsored Wadlow, had to keep spare laces like coiled phone cords and a measuring stick longer than most tables. The practical comedy of logistics, where to sleep, how to sit, which car to fit, becomes a scatter of problem-solving that friends, stagehands, and strangers share. Historians still argue whether the public's appetite for the tallest is voyeurism or awe. You suspect it's both braided with a third-strand gratitude, that bodies come in more sizes than rules. On your way out, you pass a mirror, and the gallery shrinks to fit your reflection. Your ankles feel fine. Your heart keeps a reliable beat. You think of the square cube bouncer checking IDs at the door of Galileo's beams, and Haldane's mice of Megafauna, and mistranslations of Cyclops skulls, and basalt beds of Cardiff's tobacco-stained gypsum, and Lovelock's fading red hair. Then you think of 2 young men, both gone at 22, who taught the world something truer than a hoax ever could, that height without help is heavy, and that the most human thing about a giant is how much care it takes to move through a doorway. Joke 3, you promise, your knees you'll treat them like precious archaeological sites. No reckless excavations, plenty of support and snacks. You flip the lights in your head and let the gallery dim. Real giants exist, but as medical biographies under bright bulbs, not as Stone Age phalanxes stomping across river valleys. The story you carry to bed is not a debunking sneer. It's a soft admiration for people who lived at the edge of the ruler, and for the clinicians and carpenters who helped them stay there a little longer. You step into a storeroom that clicks with metal rulers and quiet drawers, and tonight, your torch becomes a measuring tape. If stories grow taller in the retelling, bones get shorter under good light, unless you measure them wrong. Your job isn't to argue with legends, it's to give a femur a fair hearing and keep the square cube bouncer from having to testify. You lay an osteometric board on the table wood, smooth as river stone, and whisper the calm phrase that saves everyone a headache, later prove it with centimeters. Begin with the workhorse regression from long bones. You cradle a femur seat the head against the board's fixed end, slide the stop to the distal condyles and read the maximum length. Feed that number into stature equations, the classic Trotter and Gleiser formulas built from large samples of mid-20th century people, and out comes an estimate with a range not a boast. You repeat for tibia and humerus, where you have them knowing each element carries its own standard error. Add sex and broad ancestry when known, because bodies are not interchangeable. The same femur length can predict slightly different living statures in different populations. You write the plus alongside the answer like a seatbelt. Joke 1, the plus is the nerd's way of saying, don't drive this estimate like you stole it. When the skeleton is complete enough, you switch to the anatomical. Fully method measure the heights of the vertebral bodies, sacrum, femur, tibia, talus, and calcaneus, then add a soft tissue correction so the person isn't sentenced to walk around on bone. Later revisions. Raxter and colleagues polish those corrections so your math doesn't leave anyone tiptoeing or barefoot in the afterlife. The beauty of the anatomical method is that it listens to the whole body. The limitation is that it needs the whole body to show up. In real digs, somebody always forgot to RSVP. Context keeps you honest. In commingled burials, ossuaries, caves, tombs reused across generations, you count a minimum number of individuals, MNI and pair, left with left-right, with right, adult with adult, child with child. One creature, one set. You learned that back in the Cyclops field, when a cow pelvis flirted with a human shin. Get that wrong, and the table grows a stranger. You also read taphonomy. Like weather soil, acidity thins bone. Soaking swells it. Drying near a hearth can warp shafts. Roots etch squiggles. Gnaw marks confess night visitors. Historians still argue whether certain unusually long bones in old reports were truly human or borrowed from large mammals by accident. Confidence rises sharply when excavation is controlled and the notes are legible. You try a cautionary exercise. Imagine estimating stature in the trench from head to toe without recovering the bones first. The grave has slumped, the knees flex, the toes point. You pull the tape over air pockets and call it a day. Congratulations, you just wrote a 19th century newspaper. On the bench, the re-articulated long bones tell a quieter story. Joke 2, in situ inches, and fish stories share a measuring tape. Footprints whisper too, and they need translators. People love to multiply foot length by a rule of thumb to get height. Sometimes it's a decent ballpark. Laetoli's ancient trackmakers let you place Australopithecus afarensis within a plausible range, but variation between individuals and footwear makes the shortcut skittish. Moist sand lengthens prints, hard clay shortens them, a heavy load flattens arches. A child borrows a parent's sandal, and suddenly a giant passed by. Historians still argue whether particular prehistoric trackways justify stature claims beyond tall for their group, because speed, substrate, and stride complicate the math faster than headlines admit. Now the math's manners. Every estimate deserves its plasterals. Those little plus or minus tails are where humility lives. A single femur might predict living height within a few centimeters. Combine bones, and you often do better. Cadaver versus living height differs as well. Diurnal compression steals a centimeter or two. By bedtime age, steals more across decades. A quirky tidbit for your pocket forensic anthropologists know, driver's licenses often exaggerate stature by optimism. The bones in the end zone throw the challenge flag. Scale bars rescue photographs from enthusiasm. Old snapshots of giant skulls on shovels shrink to normal the moment a metric ruler enters the frame. Perspective lies objects near the lens loom, and wide angles stretch truths like taffy. Photogrammetry. Careful 3D measurement from overlapping images mends some of that, but only when you seed the scene with known dimensions. If a report shows a skull with men squatting far behind it, hats askew, you're looking at a portrait of pride, not a laboratory record. Historians still argue whether some famous giant skull photos began as art projects or pranks, but everyone agrees a scale bar would have put them to bed early. Even measuring a single bone takes etiquette. Landmarks are precise, the femoral head's most superior point to the most distal condylar plane, the tibia's intercondylar eminence to the bottom of the medial malleolus. Be careful, some formulas want the bone without the malleolus. Mix methods and your spreadsheet grows bilingual errors. You write your choices in the notes as if a stranger will audit you, which they will. Replicability isn't rudeness, it's hospitality for future curiosity. You keep an eye on shrink and swell. Cremation and burning shorten bones dramatically. Waterlogging preserves but warps. Desiccation can curl flat bones like autumn leaves. Rapid mineral uptake can add a fragile crust that fools calipers into reading more substance than the person owned in life. Historians still argue whether certain ancient populations' average statures are truly shorter or whether curated samples, war cemeteries, monastic yards underrepresent tall farmers who died elsewhere. Assemblage bias is the quiet prankster of stature charts. When you do get a very tall individual, because they occur, you document like a love letter. Are limb proportions consistent? Are joint surfaces robust enough, or does pathology explain the height? Do vertebrae show Schmall's nodes, osteophytes compression? Is the pituitary fossa enlarged, hinting at endocrine causes? Are grave goods scaled ordinarily or oversized? The material culture around the body tattles on community scale. Door frames, beds, boats, tools. A cemetery with one tall outlier is a neighborhood. A cemetery full of alleged titans should bring you bigger everything, footwear, weapons, thresholds, or at least bigger repair bills. That evidence never lines up the way giant rumors hope. Your measuring sticks have cousins with different jobs. In living people, stadiometers mark standing height. In the deceased, the cadaver board reports recumbent length. Add diurnal and age corrections if you're trying to match ante-mortem records. In prints, stride length and hip height dance together. In photographs, vanishing points bully scale unless you anchor them. And in old reports, units betray you cubits vary by culture. Spans are hand-sized and hands vary. Giant is sometimes just a moral adjective in a story with no math. Shoes and stories meddle from the sidelines. Thick sandals add a centimeter, platform soles add a boast. Riders lengthen in the horizon's squeeze. Written heights in chronicles, love round numbers 10 cubits for drama, 6 for intimidation, 4 and a span, when a scribe kept his coffee. Your earlier scroll lesson returns. Translators chose gigantes for complicated reasons. You choose centimeters for simple ones, then translate back into story with care. Because you like your callbacks neat, you return to the basalt giant's beds and the Cardiff tent. In both scale entered without a ruler. When you relabel the dolmen as a Bronze Age burial or the gypsum as a hoax, you don't murder wonder. You put it in a museum with good lighting and better captions. The true giants of measurement are the small disciplines, consistent landmarks, clear photographs, shared equations, and the humility to say estimate. Joke 3, nothing in archaeology travels faster than a number without a plus, except your regret. A last checklist before you close the drawer. 1. Identify the element and side. 2. Note maturity epiphyses fused or not. 3. Record maximum lengths with landmarks stated. 4. Choose regression or anatomical method appropriate to preservation. 5. Apply population-specific equations where justified otherwise. Report broader ranges. 6. State standard errors. 7. Cross-check with other lines. footwear size, associated architecture, documentary claims. 8. Archive your data so someone else can reproduce it. The bones won't mind. They prefer second opinions. You switch off the lab light, and the room remembers its bones. Measuring isn't the enemy of mystery. It's the lullaby that lets you trust what you've learned. Tomorrow somebody will hand you a photograph of a shovel and a skull and a sunset, and you'll ask for a scale bar like it's a second cup of tea. That habit, more than any single equation, keeps your ankles and your imagination on speaking terms. When a giant walks onto your table, now they arrive as a person with centimeters and context, not as a rumor in need of taller ink. You watch the horizon turn velvet and feel the old question ask itself again without your help. Why do giants keep showing up when bones don't? You don't scold the mind for wanting them. You listen for the jobs they do. Size is shorthand, its meaning written in capital letters. When a story needs to make courage visible, it makes the hero climb something huge and the threat larger still. When a community needs to remember itself, it builds tall cathedrals, stellate mounds, and then tells a flattering after-story that the builders were bigger because bigness is a convenient synonym for importance. You keep your torch steady and let that simple trick glow. Scale is a tool, not a measurement. You stroll past a shelf of cultural habits and tap each one gently. Children meet the world in giants because every useful adult is already huge. Fairy tales just color in the scale with eyebrows and boots. Rulers commission statues at 2-3-10 human heights because authority looks taller through stone. Parades carry oversized effigies so the back row can cheer the outline of power. A mainstream peg to tuck in your pocket on roads in the 3rd century BCE, the Colossus of Helios, one of the 7 wonders, stood roughly 30 meters high before an earthquake toppled it. It was civic theater in bronze, not a fossilized citizen. The impulse did not start online. Psychology hands you quieter rulers. In dreams and myths, giants often carry what you fear to name storm's hunger. The neighboring tribe grief. Make the problem tall and you can see where to swing. Make the helper tall and you can lean. Historians still argue whether those choices are near universal wiring in the human mind or fashions that traveled along trade routes and scriptures. Either way, the repeatable trick keeps you company from Iceland to India. The bigger the stakes, the bigger the silhouette, until the lesson is large enough for a child by a fire to see it and carry it to morning without dropping any meaning on the way. You tilt your light across memory's workshop and watch how errors harden into culture. A Cyclops skull's giant nasal cavity becomes a one-eyed shepherd-eater. A basalt dolmen turns into a giant's bed. A Cardiff tent fills with tickets and tobacco-stained gypsum. A Lovelock bundle blushes red in alkali dust and grows a legend on the drive home. The details differ. The muscle memory doesn't or looks for a body to wear. Joke 1, your brain is a brilliant costume department on a budget. You're not here to sneer at that habit. You're here to recognize it, smile at it, and then set a scale bar down beside it like a cup of tea. Even in your most modern rooms, the appetite persists. Sports feeds you graphics where wingspan gets its own halo. Skyscrapers market cities as vertical personalities. Superhero films skip past 6 feet to 30-meter robots because spectacle scales like popcorn. Roadside largest twine balls, beavers, Adirondack chairs scratch the same itch with plywood and county pride. A quirky tidbit to carry across parts of Spain. Portugal, Belgium, and beyond towns still parade festival giants, papier-mâché gigants, taller than doorways, so crowds can see their history move. We literally put giants on our shoulders when we want memory to travel down a street. There's another reason the rumor never dies. Giants are a tidy way to explain big works without paying modern-sized respect to the ordinary hands that made them. If giants did it, you don't owe the neighbor's ancestors anything but a shrug. If ordinary people did it with ropes, winters, and calendars, you owe them awe and sometimes restitution. Historians still argue whether 19th century giant talk around American mounds was naive wonder or calculated erasure. Either way, your tape measure knows which story fits the post holes. Real communities leave layers, food scraps, tools, repairs that read human from every angle, even when the platforms are tall and the plazas wide. You keep an ear tuned to a softer frequency, the private scale of wish and worry. Tallness can be a tiny daydream when you feel small in the room, a PG-13 power fantasy that lives in your shoulders for the length of a sigh. You smile because you recognize it the moment in traffic when you want your bumper to be a mammoth tusk. The meeting where a few extra inches of voice would be nice. Jokes are safe ways to stretch. Joke 2, emotionally, everyone is 6'2" on the internet. The mind isn't lying when it reaches for height. It's testing how it would feel if the world listened a little faster. Then there's the pleasure of scale itself. Humans err extremes because they let you test the rules you live by without breaking anything. A flea circus teaches Haldane's lesson with a grin. A museum diorama of mammoths lets you feel small without being prey. A story about a jötnar lets you practice arguing with winter and losing with grace. The exercise is rehearsal. You walk back into your ordinary hallway a little braver, not because giants exist, but because the tale lent you borrowed shoulders for 10 minutes. The square cube law doesn't mind. It nods from the doorway like a chaperone who knows you'll be home by 10. Memory being practical also stores data as metaphors. Giant can mean ancient enemy protector, monumental, or simply don't go there after dark. In oral traditions, those labels are fast, durable, and portable. Write 3 meters on a potsherd, and you'll misplace it. Say giant at the spring where children fetch water, and you've pinned meaning to a map. They will never lose. Historians still argue whether specific giant tales preserve blurry snapshots of real extinctions, eruptions, or rare encounters with unusually tall individuals. But everyone agrees the category keeps working, because it is easy to remember and easy to hand down. You line up tonight's callbacks like friendly silhouettes. The Cyclops' eye, that is really a nose. The bamboo forest with a molar heavy as a secret. Wrangell's late mammoths, small but loud in memory. Bashan's iron bed, probably basalt bragging. Cardiff's prank smiling in a tent like a sleepy uncle. Lovelock's duck decoys whittled prettier than rumors. Wadlow's gentle handshake and too brief calendar. The square cube law leaning on the doorframe amused. None of them cancel wonder. They tune it so ankles stay safe and evidence stays honest. So did prehistoric giants really exist? You smile into the dark and answer the way the ground has been coaching you to answer all night, not as tribes of healthy 10-foot hunters ruling valleys, but as neighbors misread into giants by skulls, stones, and stories, as genuine megafauna that deserved their thunder, as rare medical outliers who paid a price to brush the ceiling, as metaphors that carry weather pride, boundary law, and warning. In the end, the biggest things in prehistory were usually not people, and the biggest things in people were not their bones, but their coordinated hands. You breathe, and the room breathes back. You can let the giants shrink to their honest shapes without losing wonder, because wonder was never about height. It was about stepping into the cave with a torch reading old handprints like postcards and feeling your own hand lift to meet the rock. It was about hearing mammoth wind in the grass and feeling small in the best way. It was about realizing that giants were often just your ancestors doing careful, heavy work together until the winter was fed. Joke 3 somewhere, a foreman from 3000 BCE is still waiting for you to return his good rope. So you put away the tape, pat the notebooks, and leave the hallway light on low. Out beyond the window, the dark is big enough for any tale you need it to hold, but here inside scale has settled, Doorways are modest ankles, are grateful, and the square cube, law, faithful chaperone of the night, waves you toward rest. Let the hallway grow quiet. Let the torch hush to a steady ember, warm at your toes, so the light pools small and kind, and everything beyond it softens and steps back. You've walked far enough for now. The square cube bouncer has taken off his jacket and leaned it over a chair. Even the mammoths in your head fold their legs and turn into gentle hills, and the wind that worried the grass earlier becomes the slow whisper of a fan. Breathe in slow and low, like you're filling a clay jar. Breathe out as if you're pouring water for a friend. The crickets outside the window are doing the counting for you. You don't have to keep score. If you place your palm lightly on the blanket, you can imagine the cool of a cave wall under your skin, old handprints, old breath, old quiet reaching across time. Not to alarm you, but to keep you company. It is a long, patient kind of company. If any leftover giants are still pacing at the edge of the room, let them change their clothes. The Cyclops returns to a sun-warmed skull on a hillside. The iron bed in Bashan is just a black rock holding daytime heat for tomorrow's lizards. The red hair at Lovelock fades to straw under a calm light. Cardiff's gypsum rolls onto its side and snores. Everything that felt too big a few minutes ago sets itself down carefully, the way you slide a book back onto its shelf and hear the soft thrum of order returning. You are smaller than mountains and bigger than worries. You are exactly the right size for your room. The air is easy. The pillow knows your name. The dark is friendly. Doorways everywhere tonight are the right height, and every step you took through caves and plains has set itself back down in quiet lines. In the morning, measurements will still be waiting, and stories will still be tall, but neither will ask anything from you now. For this hour, there is only the tide of your breath, the steady hum, and the gentle fact that you are here safe and unhurried. Close your eyes. Let the ember dim the hallway soften, the shore of thought recede. Good night.